Darth Vader watched as the flames licked at his black armor. It seemed fitting. His soul, the soul of Anakin Skywalker, died in the fire of molten lava. Now his body will crumble in fire as well. From behind the funeral pyre, Luke's gaze wandered through the darkness of the night, and for a moment Vader almost believed his son could see him. A wry smile grazed his lips at the thought. It was silly, of course. Vader was dead, for good this time, and Luke wouldn't ever be able to see him again. The Sith Lord didn't know how long he would be able to hold onto the Force with his mind alone. Soon his spirit would be whisked away, and then he wouldn't be able to see Luke anymore either. But then his son smiled back at him and actually waved. Vader blinked in shock. He looked down at himself. No, he was still nothing but a blue-white spirit. He looked just like he had done the day before he'd had his limbs severed. It was the form he had chosen when he found out he could give his soul an appearance, even if just for himself. Nobody else seemed to be able to see him. He had wandered around the remains of the Imperial Navy and later the Rebel celebration for almost half an hour in search for his son, only to find him far away from the feast, taking care of his dead body. He'd stayed true to his word after all. Luke didn't leave him alone. He'd brought his body back from the Death Star before it blew up, even though he risked his own life doing so. Such loyalty, undeserved too, simply eluded Vader. He did not understand how his son could be such a shining light. He was so pure, so innocent, and believed in the good where darkness had been at home for decades. He was weak too. Vader had been able to easily overpower him in every of their duels. The only time Luke had been able to get an advantage over him had been when he'd drawn on the dark side in his anger, when he for just a moment attacked with the intent to kill. It had thrown Vader off his track. He'd been reminded of his own fall, and the pain of the memory had distracted him for just a second. A second that had cost him his hand. Not that it was a great loss, it being mechanical and all. Yes, Luke was weak. He wasn't a great sword fighter like Darth Maul. He didn't have much finesse like Darth Tyrannies. He didn't have Vader's raw power, and he most certainly wasn't a genius like Sidious. He had a lot of potential, but the Force didn't obey him as it did Vader. He didn't even know how to reflect Sith lighting. Then again, Luke had only had a few months of Jedi training. Considering that, his progress was mind-boggling. He was weak for a Jedi but incredibly powerful for a Padawan. The sad thing was that as the only Jedi alive, he would never get any further teaching, light or dark. He would never reach his full potential. Luke had turned away from the funeral pyre. He went to join the celebration again, and Vader turned away as well, ready to go to wherever the Force led him. However, as he started paying attention to his surroundings again, he was suddenly met with the white spirits of two Jedi he knew all too well. Master Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi both stood there, the first gripping his glimmer stick while the latter one had his arms crossed in front of his chest. "You," he muttered, resentment raising its head immediately. His shock was momentarily overriding his instinct to draw his lightsaber. Nonetheless, he felt the weapon materializing at his hip, or not materializing, since he was but a projection. Why hadn't he heard or sensed them before? It must be a side effect of being dead. "There is no peace, there is serenity," Kenobi said with a slight smile. "Have you forgotten?" Vader shook his head mutely. "Turned back to the light, you have," Yoda explained and nodded to the pyre. "Rid yourself of the darkness in your heart, you have, Skywalker." That is not my name," he wanted to say, but found the words died in his throat. He hadn't turned back. Or had he? He'd certainly turned against his master, and he'd done so not to take his place but to protect his son. That is not how a Sith would act. At the same time, it was not how a Jedi would act either, what with the fear of attachment and all. "It is good to have you back, Anakin," Kenobi said, smiling. Vader stared at him. He'd spent so many years hating this man. Hating him for mutilating him, for taking Padme from him, for hiding his son, his children from him. Now Kenobi looked at him as if he'd forgiven him. Kenobi had no right to forgive him. It should be the other way around. The Jedi's smile faltered as if he could sense the rising darkness in Vader's heart. Maybe he could. Am I going to spend the rest of eternity with you now? Vader all but spat. He would love to kill Kenobi again and again, but he doubted it was possible in their current state. If the will of the Force it is, Yoda answered. The only Jedi whose spirit the Force has kept near the mortal realm, we are not. Surprise me if you, as the Chosen One, will join us. It will not. Is that so? He asked with a scoff. How many Darksiders have joined you in the Force? His non-existing stomach clenched painfully at the prospect of having to face even more Jedi, a large part of whom he had probably killed himself. How can you still insist that I am the Chosen One after everything that happened? He'd done everything he could to go against that dang prophecy. A part of him had always enjoyed doing so just because it meant opposing the Jedi. Yoda shook his head. Misinterpreted, the prophecy has been. For hundreds of years, ruled the light has. To bring balance to the Force, chase away the light you had to. When the darkness got too overwhelming, chase away you did it as well. Now nothing is left of both Sith and Jedi teaching. Rise to new heights unhindered by the past, a new generation can. Then all this time, Vader asked with a growl, it was my destiny to destroy both orders, so they can be rebuilt. I think it is very much obvious with you, Kenobi replied, that nothing, not even fate can tell you what to do. Even if your destiny might have been set, the way of how you go about fulfilling it was always up to you. Told us about your wife, you should have, Yoda mused. Tried to rebuild the order, we might have. If Kenobi's words were like a knife to his stomach, Yoda gave it a good twist. Even if I told you, it would not have made a difference, he insisted. You never trusted me, you would have expelled me from the order. You, all of you, you were jealous and afraid of my power. I could not count on help, that is why I did what I did. But you didn't even ask, Kenobi replied sadly. Blinded by our fear of the darkness, we have been. Failed, we all have, Yoda said. Know this, I do now. And wasn't that even worse, because it meant that no matter what he did, he had always been destined to fall. It is time for us, Kenobi whispered and looked into the distance. The Force is calling for us. He turned to Vader again. Will you come with us? Do I have a choice? He snarled. I believe you do. At the very least, I believe you deserve one, his old master said sadly. Then I refuse to go with you, Darth Vader answered resolutely. If I have followed the will of the Force for all my life, let me follow my own will in death at least. Kenobi didn't look surprised, but he looked sad still. Vader couldn't figure him out. Anger he would have understood, fear he would have welcomed. But Kenobi's mourning was unsettling. The two old Jedi took their leave and Vader watched as their spirits faded away. He felt the Force tug at his mind and he raised his head to look up into the sky. If I am truly your chosen one, let me choose for myself just this once. Let me go. His old Jedi Master had often said that the Force loved him because of the way it clung to him. It was a side effect of being spawned by midi-chlorians. The Force had always easily replied to his every command, both as a Jedi and as a Sith. He had often heard it whisper during meditation, guiding his way. The problem was that he'd heard it whisper both from the light and from the dark side, and at that time, the dark had simply been louder. Now he wanted nothing more than for the Force to finally shut up. He wanted to be free. He hadn't been free as a child, bound in slavery. He hadn't been free as a Jedi, first bound to his master as a Padawan and then bound to the Council as a knight. He hadn't even been free as a Sith, bound to the Emperor. He was so sick of having a master. He was too emotional to give up on all attachment, but he yearned so much to be the one doing the binding himself. And for once in his life, he felt a faint sense of acknowledgement from the Force. A faint breeze seemed to brush over his face. His wish would be granted. Letting out the breath he hadn't known he'd been holding, Vader felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He gave up all resistance and allowed the Force to take a hold of his spirit. Wherever it would take him, it had better be a dang good place. Preferably one where he would be able to see his family again one day. XXX. When Darth Vader felt his senses return to him, he felt momentarily overwhelmed. He was lying on his back in the middle of an empty wasteland, but there were so many information storming at him. He could feel the sand and the heat on his bare skin. He could smell the dust and Sith had it been long since he last smelled anything. He took a deep breath, and other than in his spirit form, this time he actually felt how the air flooded his lungs, and it felt incredible. Slowly the Sith Lord sat up and marveled at his organic hands and feet, covered by his black Jedi robes. He looked around and enjoyed the sight of the Tatooine twin suns, unblemished by the red tint of his mask. Wait a moment. Tatooine? Indeed, he would recognize those suns anywhere. It seemed he was on his planet of origin he would never call at home, and he had no idea how he got here. A bit shakily he got to his feet. He could feel the Force in the air around him, but curiously, the underlying whisper that usually came with it was absent. Vader resumed a meditation pose and silently posed his questions. Am I on Tatooine? He got a sense of agreement, further cementing his suspicion. Is this my afterlife? Afterlife, this word echoed in his mind a few times, but there was something wrong about it. This wasn't his afterlife, but his life. What did that mean? It could not. Am I alive again? The Force hummed in contentment. For a moment, Vader felt his jaw slack. Could it even do that? Why am I here? The Force never actually spoke, but it usually nudged his thoughts in one direction or another. He expected the light to tell him he had to right his wrongs, or the dark to finish what he began. Sometimes it was hard to ascertain which side spoke to him, but it had gotten easier during the years, mainly because he'd learned to shut out the light. But now, he got nothing. Not the slightest push. His mind was completely blank. What should I do? He asked again, but the Force stayed silent. He thought maybe he'd lost the connection. In which direction can I find life forms the fastest? He asked next, and this time he got a nudge of the Force to go west. He hadn't lost his connection, but then, why wouldn't the Force tell him what to do? It was then that he realized, there was nothing for him to do. He'd fulfilled his destiny and the Force had granted his wish. It had set him free. He could still use the Force and had all his powers, but there were no responsibilities connected to them anymore. Just to test this, Vader called upon the dark side, and it filled him up instantly, chasing away the ache in his body from lying in the sun for so long, sharpening his senses and filling him with excitement, but not much else. Usually he had to bait the dark by offering it intense feelings such as pain or anger, and it swallowed these emotions, returning them to him tenfold. Nothing of that sort happened this time. The power was there, it filled him up, but it didn't take him over. He felt no need to fight any murderous urges either. When he let go of the power, it was like coming down from a high, but without the painful crush at the end. It was beyond puzzling. In the end, it was up to Vader himself to make a decision. Even though he had yearned it for so long, he didn't actually know how to be free. What would he do? Where would he go? He could do anything. He could take over the Empire in Sidious's stead. It would prevent a civil war, while at the same time he wouldn't have to give up any of the power he got so used to. But Vader was more of an action person. He knew he didn't have the patience to sit on a throne the whole day. It was one of the main reasons why he hadn't betrayed his master before. He could try to find his children and work with them and the rebels to reinstate a republic. Maybe together they'd be able to prevent most of the bloodshed. But despite everything, Vader felt he didn't really want the Empire to be destroyed, the Empire he had spent so much time building with his own two hands. He had spent so much time hunting down rebels, and his disgust for them was real. Dare he say it? Loved his children. But that had nothing to do with his political views, and he could still hate the rebels. No, it was probably best if they believed him to be dead, at least for now. Maybe he would just stay out of politics. He knew he couldn't do it for long. He always longed to be in the middle of everything, but he felt he needed some time to decide where his way would lead from here on. Tatooine was as good a place as any to hide on. Vader sat down and began to draw a miniature map of the planet into the sand. Then he let his finger hover over it, letting the Force guide his movements. As he knew it would, he got no incentive on the question where to go, but he could at least ascertain his position that way. He wasn't too far away from the hut that he had inhabited together with his mother when he was a child. Luke grew up at a similar place. He'd researched that after finding out who the daring pilot was that blew up his Death Star. He wasn't too far from Mos Eisley either, the city where he was most likely to get a transport off the planet if he so wished. The Force did indeed leave him a choice. Vader hesitated, but in the end, decided he would go to the hut. He needed to meditate. When things come to a close, you think back to the beginning. It was a long walk, and while he grew thirsty with time, he could use the Force to strengthen his body and made it to the hut in record time. It still seemed to be inhabited. Someone else must have taken the site for himself. Vader felt a rush of anger at the thought, but it was a lonely spike and he didn't feel the darkness rush to his side to feed on it. It was strange to have his anger just vanish like that. As a Sith, he would have searched for the new owner and killed him just for daring to live here. Wait, that sounded as if he wasn't a Sith anymore. But he was. Or was he? Shaking his head, Vader closed in on the pathetic abode. It reminded him so much of the place he was raised at. He felt only one presence in the hut. Deciding he would find out who lived here before going on a killing spree, Vader knocked. A few seconds passed before the door was opened. Vader felt a chill settle in his stomach. It was not possible. In front of him there stood his mother. Or at least, the woman strongly resembled his mother. She was a lot younger, and it was strange not seeing her in pain. His most recent memory of her was the one of her dying at the hands of the Tusken, and it was this memory that had overshadowed each and every other until he could barely remember what her face looked like without blood stains on it. Shmi Skywalker was clearly surprised to see him, but she didn't seem to recognize him. "Hello, what can I do for you?" she asked, carefully neutral. Vader just stared at her. How could she be alive? Had the Force lied? Was this the afterlife and he was just as dead as her? But then why didn't she recognize him? He looked barely a few years older than when she had last seen him, shortly before dying. "You don't know me," he made sure, failing to keep the incredulity out of his voice. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't remember ever seeing you." Vader flinched back as if she'd hit him. It felt so wrong for her to call him sir. "It is me," he hesitated. "Anakin. Don't you recognize me, Mother?" She looked him over carefully. "I'm sorry, but my son is 6 years old. You must mistake me for someone else." Vader took a step back, staring at her with a mixture of horror and shock. 6 years old, he repeated. "That can't be. Oh Force, what happened?" After a few moments, his mother took a tentative step forward and laid a calming hand on his shoulder. "Maybe you should sit down for a moment. You look very tired." Vader nodded mutely and let himself be led into the hut. He looked around and everything felt so incredibly familiar. Without him having to ask, his mother handed him a cup of bantha milk. He drank it automatically but stopped as soon as the first drop grazed his lips. It tasted absolutely wonderful. Maybe it was the long walk through the desert that had left him dehydrated. Maybe it was the fact that he'd been fed intravenously while in the suit and hadn't had the pleasures of actual food and drink, let alone any good ones, for 2 decades. Maybe it was the sudden rush of emotions from being reminded of his childhood. The taste of this milk, the milk his mother would always make for him, symbolized happiness and safety for him. Vader looked up from the cup at his mother, and for the second time in his life he felt like seeing an angel. This was the one person who had always believed in him, who had never betrayed him even when he had left her behind in slavery and been an overall bad son. She had been proud of him when she had seen him as a Jedi. He liked to think she would have been proud of him as a Sith too. After all, it was unlikely she knew he had managed to get to her unnoticed. When he held her in his arms in the Tusken village, she must have thought he fought his way free to her, even though he had only started killing sand people afterwards. He was sure she knew, and yet she said she was proud. "I'm your son," he stated breathlessly, because he needed her to know, he needed her to believe him. "I was freed from slavery and joined the Jedi for some time, but left the order. I had a wife and 2 children. When I died, the Force granted me a wish and sent me here." Hesitantly, as if she'd fade if he touched her, he covered her hand with his, just to see if she was real. "Tell me. Are you dead?" I am not," his mother stuttered, clearly not knowing how to respond to his speech. Vader let out a breath. "In that case, it seems I have been transported into the past." "You mean like time travel?" He nodded and took another sip from that fabulous milk. The shock was slowly receding. He was still surprised, but then again, he was the chosen one. Impossible things always happened around him. All the pain he had to go through. Maybe the Force agreed with Kenobi, that he deserved another chance. Not to set things right or be punished for his mistakes, but simply to make his own choices. The Force hummed around him and made him smile. Meanwhile, Shmi leaned forward, carefully studying his face. "Anakin?" she asked, shocked that she could actually recognize her son's features in this stranger. Vader nodded, feeling a ridiculous spike of happiness in his heart. His mother was alive. Wait, did that mean he could prevent her from dying? Was he actually in the past or in some kind of alternate universe? Suddenly he had his hands full of Shmi as she hugged him tightly. He almost spilled his milk from the onslaught. He had to force levitate the liquid back into the cup. "What was that for?" he asked shakily when she finally let go of him. "You looked like you could use it," his mother said with a happy smile. "And it's not every day your son visits you from the future." Vader chuckled and was surprised by himself a moment later. That had been the closest he'd gotten to a laugh in 10 years. "So, a Jedi, hey?" Shmi smiled mischievously. "Wait till Ani hears that. He's at Watto's shop till sunset, but when he comes home..." He did a double take. "He is still here?" His mother nodded. "You're surprised? Does that mean he's going to leave soon?" "He'll be free." "No, I got freed when I was 9, Vader muttered. "But he can't hear about this." "What? Why not?" "Yes, why not?" If Vader met his past self, that erased all chances for the past to play out as it was supposed to. After all, he didn't remember ever meeting an older version of himself. On the other hand, he didn't want it to play out exactly as it used to. He still hadn't decided what to do, but he would be dang ed if he let Padme die again. She would live, and so would his children. "I'm not sure if the young Anakin will even come home," Vader admitted. "It is possible that my presence in this time replaced his. If it hasn't, I need to stay close to him to be able to influence certain events that he plays an important role in. He mustn't know I'm his future self, because the Jedi would get me in trouble if they found out. I'm using what they call the dark side of the Force, and while that isn't forbidden by any law, it would draw unwanted attention. But you look so much like him, and it will only become more obvious as time passes. If you want to visit again, how do you want to explain that?" "I suppose I could pretend to be his brother," he suggested hesitantly. Shmi looked affronted. "I am not nearly old enough to be able to be your mother. If anything, you'd pass for Ani's." She stopped there, and Vader hurried to say, No, I'm not going to. But it would be the perfect explanation. My pregnancy was unexpected, to say the least. His father, your father, is unknown, if there even is any, and it would explain all the similarities. That was wrong on so many levels. Mother, I absolutely refuse. I'm not saying that you should be my husband, silly. You can say you came back out of a sense of responsibility once you learned of Ani, and that you only stay because of him. That was such a strange thought. Being back in the past, he would have liked to find Padme, but his wife was currently a child. Would always be a child, compared to him. His children, his whole reason for giving up his life, would never exist except of course if his younger self fell for Padme again. Vader could never be a father to his son, but he could be a father to young Anakin. He remembered how as a child he'd always dreamed of having a father. A powerful father that would just sweep his mother and him up, would rip this junk dealer a new one and free them from slavery. It was funny that he had become a man that could easily follow up on those dreams now. It is not only because of Ani, Shmi said. Watto isn't likely to allow you to come by to visit. But if you pretend to be Ani's father, I might convince him. What are you talking about? I'm going to free you, mother. You're not staying with that dealer any longer, and neither is my past self. But Ani, you know we can't escape. Think about the transmitters. Unless you traveled through time with a huge amount of money, I don't see how this will work. I have something better than money, Vader said with a smirk. I have the Force. Darth Vader wandered amongst the celebrating rebels, wishing they could see him, wishing he could draw his lightsaber and slay them all. But he was dead, he was nothing but a ghost, and he couldn't do anything. Vaguely he remembered that this had happened before. In a dream, maybe? Or was he dreaming now? Vader watched his son who, for some inexplicable reason, seemed to be able to see him, and he wondered what he truly felt for that boy. He'd been obsessed with him ever since he first heard of him after the destruction of the first Death Star. He'd wanted to turn him, to make him his apprentice, because that had been the only way he had been able to imagine them to stay together. He'd wanted him at his side, had wanted it so badly. At first he'd been afraid his master wouldn't allow it. After all, the Sith lived by the rule of two. If Vader took an apprentice, he might as well challenge Darth Sidious to a duel. Contrary to his expectations though, Sidious had been very understanding. He had allowed him to go on a wild goose chase after his son, and had even comforted him when he came back from Bespin, crushed by his son's rejection. In his arrogance, he truly had not expected it. He was the supreme commander of the Imperial forces, the second in command in the whole dang galaxy, a war hero and a feared but respected commander. He had not realized that the rebels were depicting him as a monster, and that his son of all people would let himself be blinded by their propaganda. But when Sidious gave up on trying to get Luke to join their side, when his torture began serving the purpose of killing painfully instead of breaking the boy's will, Vader had realized that once again, he had been manipulated. Sidious never intended to let him raise Luke. He would have either let his son kill him and take his place, or just murder the boy. The problem was that if Luke had died any other way, Vader would have immediately suspected his master and seek revenge. By letting him go after the boy, he'd given him the impression that he'd done everything to help, that his son was simply beyond any hope, and that he had to accept that he was an enemy. Only that he hadn't. He couldn't. This was his son, the one he had believed to be dead, a constant reminder of his beloved wife. XXX. Anakin fumbled with the wires and smiled in relief when the little droid came back to life. He was making good progress. Soon he would be done with his duties in the shop today. It was unlikely that Watto would let him go through. The toy Darrianer was in a terrible mood today. Even though Anakin hadn't made a single mistake and had even brought some of the larger machine parts that his mother worked on at home today, he'd still gotten beaten and refused lunch over stupid things like insulting a customer when he'd forgotten to greet. Anakin had overheard Watto talk to one of his business partners, complaining how someone had robbed him. He'd been breathless with excitement. It was unimaginable for him that someone would dare to rob the junk dealer. After all, this wasn't the only shop he owned, and he'd recently come to some money betting on a race. Plus, thievery was punished with slavery, and the Hutts made sure the law was followed. Nobody broke the law without paying them. But somehow someone had found Watto's secret store of money and taken off with it. Now Watto was practically broke. Anakin and his mother would probably be sold again soon. The boy didn't know how to feel about that. On the one hand, Watto was worse than Gardola the Hutt, but he was certainly better than most of his customers. Anakin went about his business as quiet as possible, trying to evade notice. From time to time he listened to Watto when he talked with customers, trying to gauge his mood and predict when he would come back into the shop so that he might go to the storage room, fetching this tool or that. It was in the evening when he heard Watto talk excitingly to a customer on the street, trying to get him to enter the shop, which the man did reluctantly. Anakin had seen him before. The man was tall, easily 3 times Watto's size, with expensive-looking leather clothing and a woolen black cloak. He had curly brown hair, a scar running over his right eye that was the same shade of dazzling blue as Anakin's, and a dark scowl that seemed to be permanently etched into his features. He'd come by 4 days ago searching for a droid. He hadn't bought anything, but he'd been talking to Watto for a long time back in the room where the toy Darrianer did his business. Anakin was just about to flee to the storage room when the junk dealer called out to him. "Hey boy! Come here!" Anakin ducked his head and came over, taking care to look to the ground because staring was rude. He wondered how the man got his scar. "He's a good boy, see, very good with technical stuff. A natural, really." Anakin couldn't help himself, his eyes flew up and he looked at Watto first in shock, then at the stranger. He knew that voice. It was the voice the blue idiot used when praising his goods. He wanted to sell Anakin. "He's working on the droids in this shop alone?" the stranger asked. "That's right. I have another slave working on long-term projects, but this one is taking care of the goods here." Anakin shot the man a pleading look, trying to somehow make him understand that he must not be separated from his mother. He couldn't decide whenever it helped or not, but the man said, "I could need 2 pairs of helping hands." "Oh. Is that so? Well then, I would generously accept your previous offer, make that 3 times the amount since the second slave is a rather attractive human female." "No," the man stated shortly, "the amount I named you is for both of them." "Wah, but that's... You do realize that the whole town is gossiping about you, don't you? They say you were robbed and that you don't have any money left except for what you bet on the next race together with this shop. However, they found the body of the racer you bet on in the desert. It seems he got into trouble with the Hutts. You have no cash and you're going to lose this shop soon. This deal is the best you're going to get and you know it." Watto sputtered, exasperated, and continued to bargain, or try to, for another 10 minutes, but in the end, he had to admit defeat. Anakin was relieved that he wouldn't be separated from his mother, but he didn't know what to think about this stranger. He seemed too serious and dark. He didn't know how else to describe it. Watto signed all the necessary documents and handed over the remote that controlled the slave transmitters. He offered to show him to the abode his mother stayed in, but the stranger declined, saying Anakin would lead him there. The boy didn't like the thought of having to lead the man to his mother. He didn't really look like the sort of guy that would hurt his mother for what the adults called female services, but he didn't exactly look like a mechanic either, and why else would he have bought Anakin and his mother? Was it just because Watto needed the money and they'd been cheap goods? But the guy was literally holding his life in his hand, and so he had no choice but to obey. The man, he hadn't even gotten his name, didn't speak to him at all until they reached the edge of the city. There a speeder was waiting for them. Anakin was ordered to sit behind the man and they took off. The boy wondered how he was going to find their home without asking where to go, but somehow they arrived there without turning wrong even once. I should probably go in first and tell my mom," Anakin said hesitantly. He didn't know anything about his new owner. He could be quick to temper or violent or something. "That won't be necessary," the stranger said and came to knock at the door. Shmi opened and blinked at the both of them in surprise. Suddenly the man smirked and raised the remote, showing it to his mother. "It was a succeed," he said. "You how?" His mother was shocked for a moment, and Anakin was prepared to come to her help, to explain the situation, when suddenly she let out a laugh and hugged the foreign man. "Mom?" he asked a bit helplessly, looking between the both adults. "Oh, Anakin, this is great. Now she kneeled down to hug Anakin too, and he could feel her tears against his cheek. "Everything's going to get better now, sweetie." "Mom, what's going on?" he wanted to know. "Do you know this man?" His mother looked up at their new owner. "You've told him nothing?" The man shook his head. "I thought it would be easier if you were here too." He turned to Anakin, still looking as serious as if he was about to report a natural disaster. "My name is Anakin. Anakin Vader, and I am..." He hesitated almost too long, throwing a glance at his mother. "I am your father, Anakin." Anakin felt like the ground he stood on was shaking. My father," he repeated in a daze. He too looked over at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. Suddenly a big grin spread on his face. "You're my father? Your name is Anakin too. That means I was named after you, doesn't it? Are you here to free us?" Vader's shoulders sagged in something resembling relief. "That's right." "How did you do it?" Shmi wanted to know. "It was easy. I robbed Watto's safe, tipped a bounty hunter off on the whereabouts of a certain racer he had bet on, and then bought you from him with his own money." Anakin laughed out loud. "You bought us from him with his own money?" Vader gave him a crooked smile. "Of course I did. Slave dealers don't deserve to be treated fairly." Anakin laughed again and hugged Vader, his father, around his hips, which was as high as he could get. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Vader patted the boy's head awkwardly and cleared his throat. "Yes, well, I want to take you to the town to get your transmitters removed as soon as possible. Do you feel up to the ride, Mo?" "Shmi." "Of course," the woman replied, a warm glimmer to her eyes. She looked at Vader with so much love and pride that Anakin felt a slight stab of jealousy. It was however easily squashed when his father offered that he could sit in front and steer the speeder. He'd always wanted to drive something like that. Truth to his word, Vader took them to the town, and after showing all the documents to the officials, they got the transmitters that were used by their owners to keep their slaves from fleeing by threat of explosion removed. They were now officially free. On the whole way back to the speeder, Anakin was holding onto Vader's hand. He felt like it was the happiest day of his life. XXX. Vader watched his younger self as he curled in his tiny bed. Anakin had asked him so many things, most of which he had replied only vaguely to. He did tell him that he fought in war before, though not which one, that he was a pilot and a commander. Anakin had wanted to hear stories about his adventures, and so he told him, sitting by his bed, recounting tales from the Clone Wars and his crusade against the rebels, out of order and without mentioning any names. It was strange, doing this, but he knew that as a child those impressive tales would have gone a long way in making him compliant. He didn't believe he was very good at it. His tales sounded more like battle reports than bedtime stories, but Anakin had been fascinated anyway. Eventually he fell asleep, and Vader decided it was time for him to mediate. He wanted to immerse himself into the Force completely, maybe find out more about his situation. So he closed his eyes, but instead of refuting his emotions like Jedi did, he let his thoughts wander and old memories replay. Darth Vader believed in what he did. He truly believed the Jedi were corrupt and weak, and their teachings had been bent beyond recognition from what they were supposed to be. Yes, Sidious was cruel and power-hungry, but the galaxy had needed him and his rule. When Vader had first turned, he'd only had his mind fixed on saving Padme. As the Council refused to make him a master and thus he couldn't get to the ancient Jedi knowledge, he'd decided to search in ancient Sith knowledge instead. Sidious had promised to teach him what he needed to know as soon as he helped him to establish his empire. At first Vader had hesitated. Not only were the acts his master asked of him grueling, but he was also loyal to the Republic. But then he'd heard the full plan, including Order 66. It was an order that would be carried out if one of three things happened: Chancellor Palpatine died, was put on trial, or gave the command. Even if he had killed his master that night, it wouldn't have changed much. It would have only allowed the Jedi to fight back harder. It would have resulted in civil war and have lots of civilians die. Vader had calmed his conscience with the thought that by killing these people, innocent as they were, he was saving a lot more lives that way. Then, when Padme had died anyway, everything had lost its meaning. He'd had half a mind to just kill Sidious as soon as all Jedi were dead, maybe take over the Empire instead. But to what end? Sidious had been the only friend he'd had left, and he had been so sick of betrayal, especially after his encounter with Obi-Wan. Sidious had given him a new purpose, simple tasks of go there, kill that person, strike some terror. The latter on had been ridiculously easy. With his new mask and death rattle, all he had to do was stand there and people broke down in tears. The monotony had helped him. He had never truly overcome his grief, but he had learned to channel it and feed it to the dark side, to use it productively. By the time he found out about his children, killing Sidious had never even occurred to him, not after that brief but brilliant vision of ruling together as father and son. Even then he wouldn't have been able to do it. His mechanical body was improving his speed, reflexes, and strength to inhuman levels, but it also gave him one severe weakness, and that was lighting. During to his injuries, and dang had it felt good to finally get revenge on Obi-Wan for that, he never had any chance to stand up to his master. Darth Vader opened his eyes again. It was strange. Normally, when meditating the Sith way, he recounted his day, his week, his life, and took notice on every emotion he had felt. He examined his personal opinion about people or events, and the dark side latched onto the emotions that were connected with them. That was what was so great about the dark side, it always agreed with you. The more emotionally influenced your opinion was, the more strongly the dark side supported you, but it didn't matter whenever that emotion was love or hate or anything in between. Now though the dark seemed almost indifferent to his thoughts. It didn't care about his guilt at having killed his fellow Jedi. It didn't care about his anger at being held back by them. It didn't care about his grief or his helplessness at being stuck in the suit. Vader knew that the dark had never truly cared. It was like a parasite feeding from his soul. But before, it had always made him feel in the right, always strengthened his resolve. The dark side made it impossible to regret your actions, because even when you were overwhelmed with guilt, it was impossible to reach the logical conclusion you should make up for it. Logic, cold and unemotional, was the one thing the dark did not allow, at least not during meditation. One moment you would remember your guilt, and the next you would remember your own stubbornness when you excused your actions, and the dark supported both thoughts equally. Now that Vader was able to both remember his emotions and think logically, he felt more confused than ever. The Force did not lead him any longer. His moral compass, contrary to what most people believed, he did indeed have one, was completely and utterly broken. The dark had always told him he was on the right path. The light had always forced him onto a path that had, ironically, seemed so dark to him, a path where he could find no happiness. Now though there was no path for him anywhere, he was alone in the desert. In that moment, he felt something warm brush against his shoulder. He turned to see Anakin, fast asleep, curled to a ball, facing him and unconsciously gripping his brown locks with his little hands. No, he remembered, he was not alone. He had his younger self and his mother, and both of them had their own paths before them. All he had to do was go alongside with them. XXX. 1 week later. What do you mean, leave Mos Espa? We could go wherever we want. We could move to a bigger city, you could open your own droid shop or whatever else you want to work on. With the rest of the money I got, we could even move off the planet entirely and start a new life somewhere else. Shmi didn't look convinced. But this is our home planet. Do we really need to leave? Well, we don't need to, but this was the same town he first met Obi-Wan in, and he kinda wanted to avoid seeing him, Vader thought. Ami has all of his friends here. I don't think he would like to leave, Shmi mused aloud. Vader blinked. As long as he could remember, he had always wanted to leave this dust ball behind. Then again, he couldn't remember any of his supposed friends he'd had before becoming a Jedi initiate. He was sure he must have had some because he would have remembered feeling lonely, but all he could come up with were some faceless little brats. When had he started wanting to leave Tatooine? Had he really wanted to leave because of the boredom and sand, or was it more the prospect of leaving behind slavery? Darth Vader most certainly didn't want to remain on this planet. He wanted to move around the galaxy, he wanted to fly and to fight and to get dirty lying under a ship fixing things. But he also didn't want to have young Anakin with him when he did. Maybe in 2 or 3 years, but now he was just a bit too young for it. Even then that still left Shmi. While his mother was moderately talented in repairing things, she didn't have their talent and she couldn't fly at all. He couldn't take her with him. Tatooine is dangerous, he tried again. There are smugglers, slave dealers, and the Sand People. The last time around, the Tusken killed you, Mother, and I won't let that happen again. The Tusken don't go to Mos Espa, Shmi reassured him. If we just move into the city we will be fine. But, Anakin, we have managed to survive under the most dire circumstances. Now that we are free, do you really want us to run? No, of course he didn't. He would never force Shmi to do something she didn't want. This conversation started to resemble the one he'd once had with Padme, far too much for his liking. All right, but I will make sure you will have some security droids at home. I may still leave the planet occasionally and I want you to be protected while I'm gone. What do you plan on doing? I'll get myself a ship and hunt down criminals from the Republic Most Wanted. I've worked with bounty hunters in the past, it's a business I know well. That way he would always be on the move and ready to jump in if something interesting happened in the galaxy. His fighting skills wouldn't dull with time and he could evade the Jedi. That and it paid really well. I'll make sure to return for at least a week per month to take care of you. I may even take Anakin with me when he's older if he wants to. Which I'm sure he will. While I'm gone through you have to promise me 2 things. Yes. 1. Don't let Anakin take part in a pod race with a pod that wasn't built by me, and 2. If you ever fall in love with a moisture farmer named Lars, don't move into the desert with him. You may be right about the Tusken not entering the city, but you'd be sitting ducks out there. Oh, okay. Wait, what's that about pod races? When did you ever do that? I think Watto started to make me race when I was about Bonnie's age. Anakin Skywalker. I didn't tell you until I was 8 because you'd be worried. You will not race, that is dangerous. It's how I won my freedom. The pod I built. That you built. My son will not be racing any pods that he built from some junk he found lying on the street. No, that's why it will be me doing the building and not him. It's the same. No pods. Vader would be dang Ed if he let himself be commanded by a woman. Mom. No. She gave him the look. Very well. And that's how Darth Vader got defeated. Vader looked around the underground room. The house he'd brought wasn't too big, but he had his own mediation room here. He had told Shmi and Anakin not to disturb him here. The Force would no longer tell him what to do. It was up to him to find out what was best for his new family. But it was difficult, so difficult. He knew nothing about being a father. He had been terrible at it in the past. Feeling a spark of panic in his chest, Vader sat down and breathed calmly. He knew if he ever wanted to reach a decision, he had to come to terms with his past first. Luke didn't know it, must never know, but he had recognized his wife in Princess Leia the very first moment he'd seen her. He had recognized her on that very first meeting in the Senate and had known that Sidious had lied to him. Yet he had said nothing, unable to get out of his role, unable to fight the Emperor and to some extent, unwilling to. His daughter had been so much like Padme, doing her best to protect the safety and liberty of her people in a Senate that was little more than a charade. Still, she had looked happy with her life and Vader had been content with that. Until he had found out she worked with the rebellion. Hearing that had almost been as painful as Padme's betrayal, when she brought Obi-Wan to him to kill him, only that she hadn't, not knowingly, and so he had checked twice and triple, but he couldn't deny the facts for very long. Still, she was his daughter, and so he let her escape time and time again, let her flimsy excuses and made up stories pass to keep the suspicion away from her as long as possible. After all, the rebellion was little more than a nuisance, no real threat to the Empire. Vader had never approved of the idea of a battle station that could blow up an entire planet. He was in charge of the Imperial fleet, and the Death Star had felt like the Emperor's attempt to replace him. He had been insulted. Every machine had its weakness, some way to crush it in a heartbeat. How could that station, however impressive the firepower may be, ever come close to the power of the Force? Being in charge of protecting this station had irked him to no end. He'd been almost relieved when the plans had been stolen. Only that it had been his daughter who had received them, and that there was no way he could let her go after that without letting the Emperor know who she was. From that day on, it was no longer a secret that she was a rebel. That was why he had reprogrammed her. He normally didn't do things like that. It was Sidious's favorite tool to make sure all his Red Guards and Hands and even Grand Moffs were behaving, but Vader had always preferred to pick his crew for actual loyalty. Sometimes he had turned around a rebel to send him back as a spy, but he never did it to people he liked. Or, well, as close as liking as a Sith could get. He had tortured Leia, weakened her body, and did nothing when Tarkin blew up Alderaan to weaken her emotionally until she had absolutely no defenses left. That was when he drove into her mind, sifting through her memories. At first he had tried to find something that would allow him to turn her. She was far too old to be taught in the Force, but she was not helpless. But her heart had been so pure, so much like Padme, and he knew if he wanted to turn her he had to destroy her entire personality, and he just couldn't do that. Instead, he had planted a few suggestions in her head. He shared some of his knowledge with her, enhancing her natural leadership skills, installing a great fear for the Death Star so she wouldn't ever try to get back on it on a crazy mission. He buried tiny bits of information, construction plans, maps and Imperial strategy into her head. Not enough to use it in a battle, but enough to get out of a tight situation. He knew that she would use it for the rebellion, that he was giving his enemy a powerful weapon. He was still determined to destroy the rebellion, but Leia, he wanted her to be able to escape. Then Luke had come, his existence a surprise for even him, and he had gained new hope. Luke had been trained as a Jedi, he only later found out how little training that had been, so maybe he would actually be strong enough to stand by his side. If his daughter was like Padme, maybe his son was more like him? And to a certain extent, he had been. He was a great pilot for once. He craved for adventure and even greatness, and he loved his family. He'd never been indoctrinated in the Jedi way, and yet he was, infuriatingly, light. Watching his son being tortured to death, he realized that Luke was capable of freeing himself. He was capable of getting out of this alive, but only if he used the dark side. Vader would have given his own life, would have allowed Luke to slay him and take his place if that was the only way Sidious would let him live. But Luke was refusing to do just that. His son would rather die than turn, just as he had on Bespin. It had puzzled him for a moment until he remembered a time from his youth when he had thought like that as well. He had asked himself why anyone would give up unlimited power and allow your mind and body to just crumble without fighting. Then he'd looked back on his life in the dark, on the terrible pain he suffered under daily from his injuries, on the screams and the blood that plagued his dreams, and his frustration upon realizing his children didn't want to have anything to do with him. Suddenly he'd understood all too well why Luke would rather die than become like him. When he'd grabbed Sidious to throw him down the elevator shaft, he hadn't really thought about it. If he had, the Sith Lord would have picked up on that thought through their bond and would have killed him before he even got close. But he had already been close, had been standing right next to him, and Sidious hadn't expected it. Vader had been just as shocked by his own action as he was. Yet, even as he lay dying, he couldn't bring himself to regret his choice. Yes, he left his son alone. He was so weak, and now the Empire would break out into chaos. Sidious had never allowed any advisors or senators to become serious concurrents, so the rebels had a good chance of actually taking over the government. If they did, the Empire would fight. Luke had fought with the rebels before, but in truth, they had been a pathetic little group, little more than a nuisance. Never had they bothered to do anything more than destroying Imperial weapons and freeing prisoners. They didn't have a single planet that supported them openly. Alderaan had planned to end, well, and had to hide in the Outer Rim. If they took over government, the civil war that Sidious had always warned him of would break out. His son had decades of war in front of him, 10 times worse than the occasional adventure he'd been in. Hoth was nothing against what was to come. Still, Vader didn't regret, because even though Luke was weak in combat, he was so strong in heart. A Sith Lord will always be stronger than a Jedi Master, because the dark side gave the single person power beyond what was natural. Yet there could always only be 2 Sith, and even between those two, betrayal was so common it was practically tradition. A Jedi, on the other hand, was able to join forces with as many allies as he could get and thus raise his powers to new levels. A Sith Lord might be worth 10 Jedi, but even he had no chance against 100. Luke's friends and his ability to draw people to his side would help him through the coming war. Vader was content to let him fight this battle alone, because he knew that even if he were alive, he would not be able to help him with it. With that thought in mind, for the first time he felt ready to let go. XXX. 15 months later. Young Master. Young Master, Ms. Skywalker is looking for you. I really must insist that you return to. Dang, it's 3PO. What do we do? Anakin turned to his friends, Marvin and T-Elak. The 3 boys only exchanged one meaningful glance. Run. The kids took off running and laughing, splitting up to confuse the poor protocol droid and vanishing into the dark alleys of Mos Espa. Predictably, 3PO decided to follow his young master, but the droid wasn't nearly fast enough to keep up with the young boy. Anakin sprinted down the alley, knocking over some trash bins as he went and ducked into the crowd on the other side. With a look behind him, he made sure that the droid was nowhere in sight before making his way to the meeting point. It was Anakin's 8th birthday, and his mother had allowed him to take his friends and go to watch the pod race that was being held today, but only if he took 3PO and one of their security droids with him. Anticipating this, Anakin had given all the security droids a checkup the previous evening, causing them to miraculously malfunction not 10 steps out of their flat the next day. Losing 3PO had been more difficult. Anakin had built the security droids together with his father. He was familiar with each and every update they got. But energy shields and blasters were far more interesting than the meticulous search for all the software packages 3PO needed for the ridiculous amount of languages his dad wanted him to know, including some he was sure didn't even exist, and so he hadn't spent nearly as much time with the droid. But he seemed to have lost him now. With a grin, Anakin changed directions and headed for the entrance of the racing arena. Not the public one, the one underground. This time around, he wasn't going to simply watch. This time, he would race himself. Yes, Anakin had spent the last 3 months building his own pod in secret, and he was determined to take part in this year's Bonta Eve Classic. At the entrance he met up with his friends. Marvin was a human boy 2 years older than him. He was living practically next door to the shop his mother owned. Anakin could still barely believe it. He used to work at a junk shop as a slave, and now his family owned a real droid shop, offering not only spare parts for starships but fully functional droids, security, protocol, astromech, everything was there. And Anakin got to play with all of them. Well, the harmless ones at least, and only when his dad was there to watch over him, but he was very capable in sneaking around and evade his mother's notice when he wasn't. T-Elak was a Twi'lek boy his age, the son of a regular customer. He often came by to play and sometimes even helped Anakin with his pod. "You'll see, I'll win this race for sure," Anakin promised. "I'll beat them all." "But your pod isn't even fully finished," T-Elak said. "Of course it is. You haven't painted it yet." "The paint is the least important with a pod," Anakin lectured sternly. "If it's not painted, it's not finished." "Yeah, how do we know you haven't forgotten something else?" "Look, it is finished and it's the best pod out here, okay," Anakin declared. They had just entered the hangar where all the pods were waiting for their racers. Anakin had enlisted for the race days before and brought his pod here. However, as he looked around, seeing all the shiny, streamlined pods in bright colors and with huge extra gear and power units jammed to their bellies, he felt just a tad bit nervous. "That is your super fast moving pod?" Marvin asked skeptically, pointing at the egg-shaped vehicle that had blank wires standing out where the iron cover was incomplete, rust covering most of the surface and some suspicious-looking black fluid dropping from the exhaust pipe. "It's designed to be fast, not pretty," Anakin defended his pod. "Or safe," Telak muttered. "Why do you even have to take part in this race? I mean, you could go next year and have a fully functioning pod." "Yeah, I mean, didn't you always want your father to be there when you win your first race?" "Yes, but my dad isn't there," Anakin huffed. "I'll just have to do without him. Now will you go and fetch some oil for me? I want to make a last checkup." When Anakin had first met his father, he had been so excited. He'd done so much good for his mother and him. He'd freed them, given them real work that they enjoyed. He'd stayed for around 2 months until the money he'd gotten from Watto run out. Then he'd gone off to chase some bad people that other people paid to see removed. When he came back, he always had some kind of new engine or generator or other cool things with him that he showed him how to modify or repair. Anakin loved to spend time with his dad. He was the absolutely best dad ever. He liked the same things as he did and knew so many interesting stories. His mother would often say that he was too young to do that thing or another, but when Anakin asked his dad if he would teach him something, he was always willing. Some of the things his dad taught him were strange and he wasn't allowed to talk about them to foreigners. For example, when he told him to sit on a spot silently and listen to his surroundings, listen to his own heartbeat and concentrate on his breathing, to stretch out his senses and let go of all his emotions. He called it meditating. Anakin called it boring. But he did it anyway because when he managed to sit still for 1 hour, even though his dad did all kinds of things to distract him like throwing stuff at him or getting close and breathing loud and creepily into his ear, he would teach him even cooler things. Like reaching out with his mind alone and moving tiny wires within a droid without actually touching them to get the machinery working again. Or they would sit on a bench on the marketplace, staring really hard at random passengers and send messages into their mind, commanding them to turn around, change directions, scratch their nose or grope the next female that met their eye, and then they would laugh when sometimes the people actually did it. His dad taught him reading and writing, some math and history, and what he liked best, he taught him hand-to-hand combat. Not much, and before he did it he always had to do his warm-up for 1 hour, consisting of first doing some stretching which curiously involved moving in complicated pattern that looked like dancing, and he had to do it the exact way his dad showed him or he had to start the whole dance over again. He loved his dad and he loved spending time with him, but he hated that he was only there for a few days a month and was gone most of the time. His dad had promised that he would be back for his birthday, he had promised, and yet he wasn't here, and Anakin was really disappointed about that. So disappointed that he had decided to go on this race. His father was supposed to be here, he had promised that they'd go to watch it together, but he should have arrived days ago and now he wasn't here, and so Anakin was going to go alone. And if against all odds he had managed to come, then he would sit in the arena and he would be seeing Anakin race and he would be proud of him and come and apologize for not being there earlier. Anakin worked some more on his pod, fixing that loose bolt, polishing this plate. Then he stood, looking out for his friends. They were going to fetch him some oil, but it had been 10 minutes already and he didn't see them anywhere. Scowling, Anakin set his helmet aside and went to look for them. One by one the other racers arrived. They were going to start soon. Where were his friends? Anakin searched around some more, but he couldn't see them anywhere on the hangar. At last he went to check out the corridors when he heard a familiar voice. "A little too young for pod races, aren't you?" No, I'm here with my parents, they're looking for me, please." "You know what, I think you're lying. No parents would take their kids with them on an illegal pod race. You and your little friend snuck in here alone." "No, all right, I came with my older brother, and he's this huge." Anakin ripped open the door to what appeared to be a dirty little office. In it he saw a muscular blue-skinned alien with strange horns holding his friend Marvin at his neck. Telek was sitting in a corner, his hands and feet bound with some tape covering his mouth. His eyes were staring ahead, big and frightened. "Let go of my friends," Anakin roared and charged at the surprised alien. The man dropped Marvin to throw a punch at Anakin, but the boy dodged and kicked the guy's standing leg. He'd aimed for the kneecap but was just a little off. The man howled in pain or anger, but he still reacted fast enough to grab Anakin by his collar and throw him across the room. The boy hit the ground hard and it took him some moments to shake off the pain. He heard Marvin yell for him before a punch to the head knocked him out. Anakin gave a cry, hoping that someone might hear him, but knowing that the chances of one of the other racers helping them were slim. He aimed a punch at the man's stomach, who just grinned at him and held out his hands to catch him. Right before colliding though, Anakin used a little trick he'd learned from his father, moving the guy's right foot just a tiny bit in his direction. It made the alien slip, and the punch that would have hit his stomach was now directed at his throat. The alien went down and Anakin took care to kick him firmly in the crotch before he hurried over to rid Telek of his bonds. It was just then that the door opened again. Anakin whirled around, catching a glimpse of another big guy with dark skin, then something heavy hit him right at his temple and the world went dark. Vader punched in a code into the interface of his starship and waited impatiently for the connection to establish. Behind him a groan could be heard. Vader threw a fleeting glance over his shoulder at the prisoner. Nolan Fried was a drug dealer, the head of a pirate crew that had been bothering the Aldrianer for some time now. There was a nice bounty on his head, but the chase had been difficult and nerve-wracking. Not because Fried was a good fighter or anything. No, as he got to him it had been disgustingly easy to get past his security and disable him. It was the search that was the biggest problem. Darth Vader had slowly begun to make himself a name, and the usual undercover story didn't work anymore. People had started to remember his face. He'd had to chase Fried across half the galaxy. When he'd finally found him, he'd been tempted to just kill him for all the trouble. Sometimes he did that, when the crimes his targets had committed were especially terrible, the target himself was too dangerous to take alive, or execution was a part of the deal. But he did try to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. His killings so far had always been on the legal side, since he was hunting criminals and could always claim to have acted in self-defense, but if you got the reputation of being a merciless killer, you were stuck with that image for the rest of your life, and governments would stop making deals with him. Well, the good, non-corrupt ones would stop, and he didn't want to work for the other side. So that's why he had left Fried alive. Unfortunately, he hadn't had time to deliver him. It was his birthday today, which meant it was also the birthday of his younger self, his son. It was still strange to think it, but Vader had spent so much time wishing and imagining that he could have been there for Luke sooner, what he would have taught him and stuff, that he had fallen into his role with surprising ease. He had promised the boy he would be there for his birthday, and he was determined to do so. If that meant leaving a bound and gagged drug dealer in his ship for a few days, then so be it. Fried was now fully awake. Realizing the situation he was in, he tried to struggle against the energy rope that bound him to the co-pilot seat, all the while eyeing the thick needle that went into his forearm warily. "You don't mind being fed intravenously, do you?" Vader asked stoically, not looking up from the steering unit. "I'll have to leave you here for a few days, and I really don't have the time to take care of you. MHHMRMPH. I know, and I would reassure you if I could, but I'm afraid it's just as bad as it looks. Since I'm fairly certain you test your goods frequently, your body will soon react to the absence of those disgusting substances. First you'll start sweating and shaking, then the pain starts, making you think you're burning from inside out. I know what I'm talking about. I got through a bad time when I decided I didn't need any pain relievers anymore. You'll start hallucinating and have nightmares, and oh, let's not forget that you won't be able to use the toilet while I'm gone." Vader smirked at seeing Fried's shocked expression. He might have become a tiny bit sadistic during his time as a Sith, and it had been some time since he'd last tortured anyone. "Anakin? Anakin. Vader turned around to see the small hollow image of his mother hover over the receiver. He kicked Frit against the head, not wanting him to learn anything about his family. "Hello Shmi," he greeted. He'd gotten used to calling her by her first name, since he had to uphold his disguise in front of Anakin. "I'm ready to enter the atmosphere, I'm sorry I'm a bit late. Do you know if Anakin already went to the race?" They had planned to watch the Bunta Eve Classic together today. "Oh Anakin, something terrible has happened," Shmi cried and wrung her hands. "What happened?" he asked, the scowl returning to his face instantly. "Ani is gone. He wanted to go to the race together with his friends, Marvin and T-Elak. I told them to take 3PO and a security droid, but I found it later just a few paces down the street, shut off. Then an hour ago 3PO came home again, saying he lost the boys. He probably went to the race alone," Vader assumed. "Yes, but just half an hour ago Marvin's father came to me. He got a message demanding a ransom in exchange for his son. I gave him what money we could afford to give away, but there is still no sign of the boy, and T-Elak and Anakin are still nowhere to be found. I'm afraid they got abducted." Vader felt his blood chill. Young Anakin had been abducted? Impossible. Who would ever dare to go after his family? They certainly chose the wrong child. Oh, he felt almost sorry for these idiots. Their deaths were not going to be pretty. "I will be on the planet shortly and bring him back safely, I promise you that." The hollow image died and Vader prepared his ship to enter the atmosphere. He grabbed Frit at the neck and dragged him over to a safety capsule, shoving him inside. He didn't want to return to his ship all smelly after all. The Sith Lord reached out to the Force and felt to the still somewhat unstable bond that he shared with little Anakin. He had slowly built it up over the last months, both through training the boy and building up a solid foundation of trust between them. The range wasn't that great yet, and he didn't think Anakin was aware of it. Vader was carefully shielding his emotions except when they were meditating together so as to not confuse the child, but he was occasionally able to get a glimpse of his thoughts even when he wasn't actively trying. But all he felt this time was utter blankness. Vader had a really bad feeling about this. It would be another hour at the very least until he would arrive on Tatooine, and if Anakin had somehow lost consciousness it would be so much harder to find him through the Force. He knew that he was alright, at least physically. His presence was still strong in the Force. But even though he knew better than anybody how tough Anakin was, he still worried. He would have to hurry. 1 hour later Vader arrived at the arena. He dropped all of his shields and scanned the whole crowd with the Force, searching their thoughts for an image of his son. There. Some people wondered why there were only 7 racers when it was supposed to be 8. The last one was a child and it hadn't turned up. Quickly Vader made his way to the underground hangar where the racers prepared their pods. He wouldn't be surprised if Anakin had decided to take part in the race. It was stupid and dangerous. Vader remembered the first 3 races he'd taken part in. His first self-built pod had exploded after he'd crashed into another racer. The second had simply died in the middle of the third quarter, exposing him to the Tusken marksman. The next had its tank leak out fuel that had covered 4 pods racing behind him in flammable substance which had promptly exploded. He'd been disqualified for that. No, his first attempts to build a pod had not been safe at all, and it was no wonder he hadn't finished a single race until he was 9. Still, he had always tried again, and while young Anakin was better in mechanics than he had been at that age, after all he'd had to teach himself while Anakin had a formidable mentor, he was not ready to take part in the Bunta Eve, not as long as Sebulba took part as well. That idiot was to blame for half of his crashes, having sabotaged his pod. However, a quick questioning of the racers told him that young Anakin had done just that. Vader continued his search, stretching his senses, and picked up a faint trail through the Force. It led him to a small office where he found traces of a fight. This must be where the boy had been knocked unconscious. The Sith tried to follow the trail outside, but there were so many people around that it would have taken ages to find his trail. He simply hadn't been with the boy long enough to establish a connection that he could use to find him anywhere. Silently Vader swore to rectify this. He wanted to be aware where his son was at all times, even if he had to place his own alterations into his mind. Cursing to himself, Vader decided to return home. In front of the arena he turned to his vehicle. He had landed his starfighter just outside the city, but for traveling on ground he had taken this modified speeder. He had built it himself, added a shield generator, some weaponry, and other parts to increase speed. It was a mix of speeder and pod, painted in black with blue lighting pattern, and undoubtedly, it was the fastest ground-moving vehicle on the entire planet. He was glad he had it with him now, for he suspected he had a wild chase ahead of him. There was no time to lose. 10 minutes later, Marvin's father jumped when the door was ripped open and the tall, menacing form of Darth Vader stormed into his living room. "Anakin," Shmi called out and rushed towards him. Her eyes were red from crying. She had stayed here after Marvin's father had received the demand for ransom, first to aid him with the money, then to provide emotional support. "Anakin, I'm so glad you're here." Anakin dismissed her fussing with a gesture and turned towards the man. "I heard they demanded a ransom from you. I need whatever notes or recording footage you got." I got a hollow message," the man stuttered, intimidated by Vader's commanding voice. The footage was showed to him. A big guy with a black face mask was holding a knife to a small boy's throat, delivering his message and his demands. "The money has already been put in place," Shmi explained, "but we haven't received an answer yet." "That is not surprising," Vader said neutrally. He never planned on returning the boy. "What?" The Sith looked at the desperate father. "I know eyes like those. If he returned the boy, it would only mean he risks getting captured. Now that you've paid, he's worth more dead than alive." Shmi shoot him a scolding look, but Vader couldn't feel it in himself to regret his words even as he saw the father break down before him. It was the truth after all, and nothing but cold logic was going to help him find the boys. "Where are you going?" his mother wanted to know as he turned to leave. "There aren't that many places where you can send a hollow message from," he replied. Not many households were rich enough to have a droid that could send or receive holos. "It is time to break down some doors." Darth Vader briefly returned home and checked some of Shmi's business files. He could say with good confidence that every droid far enough developed to send holos had some of its parts go through her shop at one point. Making a list of the customers wasn't difficult. Over half of them were criminals, which wasn't surprising in a town like Mos Espa. He got all of their pictures as well as the pictures of their most frequent accomplices from the network. Finally he had a short list of candidates who fit the kidnapper from what little he had seen of him. After that, all he had to do was pick one address to go to first. The Force wouldn't tell him where to go, but it did nudge him towards one place when he asked which one of them had Marvin. 15 minutes later he arrived at the house. The address was a run-down little house. There were 2 aliens playing cards in the backyard. He still felt his son's lingering Force signature, even if it was very weak. Anakin had been here. One of the thugs rose when he saw him. "This is a private property, you can't just..." Vader drew his lightsaber and cut off his head in one swift motion. The second guy gasped and stepped back, but the Sith had him in a Force choke before he could do so much as blink. None of them fit the description, so he didn't bother with questions and simply crushed his windpipe. Darth Vader kicked the door open and made his way into the house. The Force led him to a room where another 4 men of different races were having some kind of drinking game. They all sprung to their feet when they saw Vader, yellow eyes burning as the dark side flowed powerfully through him. 2 of them drew their blasters and fired instantly. Vader, though, still had his lightsaber drawn and easily blocked the lasers. One sweep took off a head, slicing through another's legs on its way down. A powerful kick sent one of the thugs across the room and breaking some bones from the sound of it. The fourth forced him to dodge as he attacked with a broken glass bottle. The Force warned him in advance of the move, and Vader almost scoffed as he brought his elbow down on the man's neck and knocked him out. The guy he had kicked let out a groan and tried to scramble to his feet, while the one without legs started shouting in pain. Vader took one look at him and stabbed him through the head with his lightsaber. He knew he could have survived if given proper treatment, and he didn't want him to live. Vader stepped over to the man slumped against a wall. Looking at him more closely, he was pretty sure it was the kidnapper. Never breaking eye contact, Vader slowly pulled out a picture from his younger self from his pocket and held it up. "I'm searching for this boy," he growled. "Where is he?" The guy suppressed a pained scream, focusing on trying to crawl away from him and to the table where some bottles had shattered during the fight. Vader didn't plan on letting him anywhere near the sharp glass. Slowly and deliberately he stepped onto the man's hand, grinding with his heavy boot until he heard the satisfying crunch of more broken bones. I don't know," the kidnapper let out and screamed in pain. "Dang it, let me go." Vader considered cutting off his hand, or better yet his arm, slice after slice. But the lightsaber pretty much cauterized the wound, making it less painful than it would normally be. Instead, he stood up and made his way over to a mechanism that he assumed was the hollow sender. In front of it there was a blue tarpaulin. He lifted it at one end and stared right into the empty eyes of a 10-year-old. He had bloody scratches on his face and hands. Vader assumed that he had fought against his kidnappers after they refused to bring him back when they got the money. Another look around showed him the bag with it in a corner of the room. Vader stepped in front of his victim. "Normally I have droids doing the interrogation for me," he drawled, sounding almost disinterested. Apparently, it's not becoming of a lord to dirty his own hands. On his good days, those when insanity had had a firm grip on his mind, he had been quite sour about that. On his bad ones, when Skywalker dared to peer out from within his black soul, he had thanked the Emperor fiercely for that rule, which of course only drove him further into his arms. "Nonetheless, I know how to do it. I may not have the proper equipment, but I have one distinctive advantage." He pointed to the unscratched thug that he had nearly knocked out. "If you don't spill, I'll simply ask the next in line." Vader held out his hand, let the dark side flow through him and directed a current of blue lighting at the man, eliciting a sweet scream. The Sith watched mercilessly as the thug screamed and shook for several seconds before he stopped the attack. Vader had never actually used Sith lighting before. Sidious had tried to teach him, but they quickly found out that his arm prosthetics suffered greatly from the current. The attack would damage him more than his enemies. But Vader knew all about the theory. He never used it on a target he had to deliver alive, but this thug was the perfect practice dummy for him. "Where is he?" he asked again. "Where is my son?" Your son?" the kidnapper asked breathlessly. "Look, I had no idea. It's nothing personal." Vader shot lighting at him again, more powerful this time. Arg. The men almost passed out from the pain. He had to make sure to regulate the current more carefully. "Where is he? What do you do to the children?" "I don't have him. I don't have him anymore. I'm just a small light, I swear." Another shock. "Freak, stop it, please, just stop. I'll tell you everything. Why did you take the children and where are they now?" "I'm part of a group. We take in children that are running around without their parents. Then all the children are herded together. The girls go to the Red Dune. The boys, sometimes we exchange them for a ransom. Not that one though was a snarky one. Almost caused our whole power system to fail, including the energy ropes, just by messing with the wiring of the lights." Yes, that did sound a lot like something Anakin would do. Vader also remembered rumors about the Red Dune. It was a big organized group of criminals that forced young girls into prostitution. "Keep talking." "Dung over there," the man nodded to the headless corpse, "wanted to kill him for that, but I said no. I saved him, all right. He was a talented one, and so we took him to our bosses, and that's all I know. We're supposed to deliver the children to them if we find someone special." "Where do I find your bosses?" "They can usually be found just outside the city walls. They wait for the next caravan to take them away. If you hurry, you might still catch them." "Oh, I will," Vader promised darkly. "That's it. I told you everything. I swear it. I believe you, the Sith answered. But that won't save you either. He began shooting lightning again with as much power as he could muster. He wanted to see how long it took for him to kill somebody this way. Listening to the dying man's screams, he tilted his head to the side. Faintly the Sith remembered the pain of being hit with such lightning. He'd been under it multiple times. The one that had finally killed him hadn't even been that painful compared to some others. After all, he couldn't feel his mechanical limbs. Finally the screams died down and there was nothing but smoldering flesh left of the man. Vader made his way out, cutting off the head of the last remaining living thug almost as an afterthought. Darth Vader felt the dark side flow freely through his veins. He felt the power and the rush that came with it, but his thinking was not nearly as influenced by it as it used to be. His decision to kill these men was a deliberate one. Not only was it time to show this town that he was not one to mess with, that no one dared to threaten his family and got away with it. At the same time, removing the witnesses allowed him to continue his charade of the law-abiding bounty hunter. Mos Espa was a town ruled by criminals, and only criminals would find out who had murdered all those men. They would understand the message. Whatever group these thugs were a part of, they weren't powerful enough to challenge the Hutts, and thus he had little retribution to fear. Of course Vader couldn't even remember the last time he had been sincerely afraid, but he did have to look out for Shmi. Vader reached the edge of the town in record time, but still when he got there the sun was starting to set. He reached out into the Force again, searching for Anakin, but the answer was still muddled. He couldn't take a map of Tatooine and let the Force tell him where his younger self was. It didn't work like that. In the old days the place the Force would send him could be ways off, starting him on yet another completely unrelated adventure. Now the answers were more precise since the Force would not play with him anymore, but they came less frequently too. It might give him a tiny edge, a little luck like it did when he picked the address to visit first, but he had to have a trail to follow. Said trail lead him to a couple of tents hiding in the shadow of the walls. There were 5 in number with 1 guard for each of them. Vader cloaked himself in the Force, made himself unnoticeable and slipped into the first tent from behind. He counted 10 children between the age of 5 to 16, 3 girls and 7 boys. There were different races, though most were human. Some were asleep, some sobbed quietly, some were holding on to each other or quietly whispering. Almost everyone had some sort of injury, a bruise here, a bloody cut there, and all of them had their hands and feet bound with blue energy ropes. They were bound to each other with it as well. Anakin was nowhere to be seen. Vader slipped out and made his way to the next tent, then the next. It was the same in everyone. In the third he recognized Telak, Ani's alien friend. Still he checked the last 2 tents before coming back. He slipped in from behind, putting a hand over Telak's mouth to keep him from screaming before releasing his grip on the Force just enough to allow the child to see him. "Quiet," he hissed when the boy let out a gasp. "I will get you out of here, but you have to tell me where they brought Anakin." Ani's with the other group, Telak managed to get out in a frightened, high-pitched voice. They sold him. He gave him a description of the kidnappers and Vader knew at once who was at fault. "Sand people," Vader growled hatefully. He'd had a feeling all along that these men were slave dealers, but this it felt like some sort of cosmic revenge. His son in the hands of the Tusken, the same people who had killed his mother in his previous life. Only that it wouldn't happen, not this time around. He would not be too late. Vader let go of the boy and slipped out as unnoticed as he'd come. Little scared Telak hesitantly called out for him, but he didn't hear any response. Then there was a series of thuds from outside. 1 minute later Vader came in again and made short work of the energy rope holding all the children together. "You over there," he said, pointing to a black-haired girl, one of the few who didn't look broken yet and one of the oldest children. "Get them all safely back into the town. Do you hear me?" "Yes sir, but what about the guards?" "There are no guards," Vader replied simply. It took him another 20 minutes to free all of the children, far too long in his mind, but they couldn't walk into the town bound like this, everybody would think they were escaped slaves. Finally he jumped into his modified speeder and took off into the desert. He knew where to find the Tusken. He always kept track of them just in case. Within 3 hours Darth Vader visited 2 separate Tusken villages, killing everyone who stepped into his way but not bothering to cleanse it of its population entirely. It was only in the third that he came along what appeared to be an auction. He managed to witness a young girl being sold to some rich criminal boss. He took a bit more time blasting them since the criminals had guards with them that were moderately skillful. In the end though he stood alone, the sand littered with cauterized body parts. At one point he had force pushed a dozen or so attackers away from him and destroyed a couple of the Tuskens' huts along with their bones. The girl that had been about to be sold sat in a corner, whimpering and trying in vain to cover her body. She hadn't been allowed to wear anything but some flimsy underwear. Vader stepped towards her, ignoring how she flinched away from him. He did however shut off his lightsaber and once again pulled out the picture of his son. "I'm searching for this boy," he said darkly. He doubted he could pull off a nice act to get her out of her panic attack. Might as well use her fear for himself. "I know he was to be sold here. Where is he?" I don't know," she sobbed. "Try to remember," he insisted. Vader leisurely directed the hilt of his lightsaber at her so if he pushed the button the blade would pierce right through her. Then he pushed the picture forward, forcing her to take a good look at it. I saw him," she hurried to say, tears streaming over her cheeks. He was one of the first. He was nice to me." "I know," he said, trying, and failing, to look comforting. "He is my son." She calmed down a little at that. "They sold him to some other traders," she whispered. "I heard some of them talk about it. They said they were taking him to the huts." She lowered her head. "I'm sorry." Evidently she believed his boy to be lost. Nobody messed with the huts. Although they were the worst criminals ever, they were practically Tatooine's government. Their current clan head on the planet was Jabba the Hutt. "Are there enough prisoners to help you escape?" Vader wanted to know. I'm not sure." The girl looked so afraid, not able to decide what was worse, risking getting caught again by Tusken or trusting the Sith that had relieved the majority of them from their heads. Vader suppressed the urge to roll his eyes and went over to the next corpse, pulling off the rags that the Tusken had used to protect himself from the desert winds. Tossing them over to the almost nude girl he said, "If you cover yourself with these they might think you are just another of theirs fleeing the village. The next town is one day on foot in that direction. If you're lucky you'll find some of their EAPs around here as well." He threw her a bottle of water but that was as far as his kindness went. He had more important things to do. His younger self would have been insistent on saving everybody or at least as many as he could, but Darth Vader had long since got rid of that idealistic attitude. He had lost too many people he cared about trying to save 10 times the amount of innocent strangers. No, if there was one thing he had learned as a Sith it was that a single life could be more valuable than hundreds of other, insignificant ones. He could live with not saving everybody, heck, he could live with killing everybody, but he could not live losing those few he considered family all over again. That is why he turned his back to the rest of the slaves, making his way to his modified black speeder to continue his search for Anakin when he heard the faint voice of the girl again. "Thank you, sir, for saving me." He turned his head a little, not enough to face her but enough to acknowledge her words. In that moment she reminded him just a little bit of his son, Luke. There is still good in you, that was what the last remaining Jedi of the world had believed. Vader's eyes fell on the remains of the Tusken he had slaughtered. He almost appreciated the irony. XXX. Anakin was grabbed by the ugly tentacle head guy and pulled from the back of the EAP. His blindfold was removed and he could see the new destination for the first time. It was a great round building, completely rusted over with no windows. It looked more like a bunker than a palace, but he knew that it was the main residence of the Hutt's head of clan, Jabba. His father had made sure he knew all the important people on Tatooine and where they could be found, even if those people were the vilest of the worst. With a sinking feeling, Anakin followed his kidnappers to the sole door of the complex. He was in for the deep this time, he knew it. Anakin and his mother had been owned by a Hutt before, and while it hadn't been that bad as long as he didn't cause any trouble, he had never seen a tighter security. On his entire way through the palace, Anakin looked for ways to escape. He had absolutely no intention of going back into slavery, not after tasting freedom and having his family reunited. He was sure that his father would come for him, he had to. But even he couldn't go against the Hutt clan, and it wasn't certain that the Hutts would sell him again after only just buying him. Luckily, Anakin didn't get to see the giant slug himself. He was merely stuffed into a cave-like room full of junk and broken droids and told to make himself useful. Immediately the boy began to look around, checking the lock on the door. He would need something very hot or acid to get through it, and the ventilation system. The ladder was too high to climb up to, but if he piled up some of the broken droids and increased the strength of his jumps like his father had showed him, maybe he would be able to get in there. If he wanted to have any chance at getting out, though, he had to wait for the night and get himself a weapon of some sort. Anakin looked to the junk again. Maybe he could find something useful in there to build himself a weapon. He began sorting through the parts. Most of it was useless and he didn't have any real tools, but he found half an astromech with an electroshock unit and a broken stun gun. If he combined both... There. It took him only 10 minutes to make his weapon. Next, he piled up some of the larger droids, using the faint hum of energy that always surrounded him to enhance his strength. At last he was able to climb up into the ventilation shaft. He took care to destroy his makeshift ladders so they wouldn't know immediately where he was. The next problem he was faced with was where to go. All the shafts looked the same. Sometimes he got to an opening and had to wait until people passed so he could continue without alerting anyone of his presence. It was during one of those episodes that he heard two aliens talk about him. Actually bought him from the Tusken? I didn't know they dealt with slaves. They don't, normally. They don't like humans. But they have a sorta deal with the Hutts. Sometimes they attack people Jabba doesn't like in exchange for food and water. Sometimes they smuggle goods and slaves from one city to another for him too. I heard they burned their hands on that last lot though. What do you mean? Dunno, some wannabe hero or parent or just crazy psychopath went through half a dozen villages, slaughtering the sand people and freeing the slaves. The guys from the day shift are lucky they got out of there before he came along. He? Do you mean a single man took on an entire village of Tusken raiders? I told you, it was at least 10 villages. Half a minute ago it was only 6. I don't believe one word of what you say. But I tell you. I mean, what if he searches for the new owners next? Maybe he'll come here. Nonsense. Nobody would dare to go against Jabba the Hutt. If he does, we'll blast him to pieces. The two men went around a corner, but Anakin stayed where he was for a couple of minutes still. Could they be talking about his father? Maybe he was back from his trip at last. Maybe he really would come to save him. But if he did... The guys were right. It didn't matter that his father was a good pilot and could hold himself against vicious criminals. Jabba had stationed so many mercenaries in his palace, it was practically an army. Even if he did come, his father wasn't likely to survive the attempt. Anakin had to get out of here before he arrived. With new fervor the boy continued his journey into the intestines of Jabba's palace, but the farther he went the more apparent it became that he was utterly and hopelessly lost. Suddenly a great tremor went through the entire building. Anakin fell flat on his face as the noise of a loud explosion rocketed the palace. He didn't know what happened, but it could only mean trouble. Anakin sat down in exhaustion. Trying to remember his lessons, the boy slowed his breathing and thought carefully about his situation, hoping for a spark of inspiration. It wasn't the first time he had gotten in a tight situation, through this was a record, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Sometimes his mother was quite desperate about his knack of finding trouble. His father, however, had never told him to keep out of it. Instead, he had taught him how to get out of it on his own once trouble had a firm grip on him. When approaching a problem, first he had to decide the way how to solve it. In this, he had to trust his heart. Then, when he had to make a plan to set his chosen method into action, he had to trust his head. Finally, when the trouble was one step away from swallowing him up whole, he had to trust his instincts. Anakin decided that trouble had pretty much devoured him already. It was time to draw upon that mysterious energy and just follow its whispers. Suddenly, he had a strange feeling to turn right on the next turn. Following his instincts, he made his way through the ventilation shaft. The next opening he came upon, he was met with a strange smell. Looking down, Anakin's eyes widened as he saw 3.5 figures lying in a heap on the corridor under him. Their limbs were strangely burnt with smoldering slash marks on their bodies and the walls. Their eyes were staring ahead with a look of frozen terror. The whispers told Anakin to get out of the shaft. He thought that was a stupid idea, but they insisted, and so the boy carefully opened the hatch and let himself fall to the ground. For almost a full minute Anakin just stood there and stared at the corpses. He had seen dead people before, hidden away in dark alleys or buried under junk. Things like that crossed everyone's path at some point in Mos Espa. But these corpses, clearly visible in the sharp light of the corridor, not sick or starved but murdered, it was not so different, actually. That's what made it so bad. Anakin felt like he should be more shocked, more afraid, more something. Instead he couldn't help but think they deserved it, this and many things more. They had wanted to take his freedom away, had wanted to make him a slave again. His father would, and then the realization came. It must be his father who did this. He came to free Anakin. But that meant he went against Jabba's entire court, and there were so many people out there. He had to find his father, had to stop him. If he saw that he was all right, they would just leave this place. The Hutts would hunt them down, but his dad knew his way around the galaxy. Maybe they could just take Mother and flee the planet. Yes, he had wanted to leave behind this boring sand planet anyway. They would be on the run, but he could handle that. He was more concerned about his mother. Anakin shook his head and made his way down the corridor. First he had to find his father. XXX. Darth Vader reflected the barrage of lasers with the blade of his red lightsaber. He had decided it would be no use sneaking into the palace. Anakin could be anywhere, from the detention block to the kitchen garden, and while his connection told him he was here and unhurt, it didn't give him directions. He could take his time and plan an elaborate rescue, or he could drop a thermal detonator through the main chimney and use the distraction to kill as many guards as possible. Since Vader was quite impatient to get his son back, he chose the latter option. In the resulting chaos he had drawn his lightsaber. The Jedi believed the Sith to be extinct since there hadn't been one in 1,000 years. He had no desire to alert them of his presence prematurely by rumors of a murdering megalomaniac with a red lightsaber. He had used a blaster in the villages and only made use of the Force if necessary, but here there were too many enemies. He needed to go all out. That meant that he had to take care to leave not a single one live. Not a single one could escape to tell rumors. He had to kill them all. Vader let out a loud cry, scaring the wits out of the underpaid mercenaries, and charged at them, beheading 2 with one sweep, deflecting a laser to kill a third and kick the last so hard he flew against a wall and cracked open his head. More and more voices were raised and screamed in panic or anger as he stepped into the next room. He saw the first ones attempting to flee. For a moment Vader concentrated on defense, reflecting the laser beams shot at him in a way that made them hit his enemies. Meanwhile he called upon the Force, gathered more of it around him than he had ever before in this time. He knew that this would not remain unnoticed. The Jedi would sense a disturbance in the Force, but since he was using the dark side, his actions were clouded and they would not be able to pinpoint him. Sidious would most certainly notice his presence. He would know there was a new player on the field. But all those years when his Sith master had taught him how to cloak himself so the Jedi he was hunting down wouldn't sense him, he could use these experiences against him now. Maybe Sidious would remember this, should Vader decide to reveal himself in the future, but he would not be able to tell much from this alone. When Vader had gathered all the power he could, he released it all at once in one mighty force push. Instantly, the entire palace experienced a blackout. Power was shut off, the lights went out, security broke down, every single droid fell to the ground, and of course, the thugs around him were all thrown against the walls like rag dolls. Most important, however, was that all doors to the outside would remain closed until Vader did something about it. Jabba's palace had turned into a death trap and Vader was the dynamite. XXX. Everywhere, the Force is, Yoda said with a content smile. Surrounding us, it does. In everything that lives, be found it can. A dozen heads with a dozen small faces were looking at him in rapture as the small Jedi Master told the younglings of the Force. He could feel their excitement, their wonder, their childish happiness that the great Master Yoda would come to them to teach, and his smile widened. Oh, the joys of youth. Suddenly, however, Yoda's eyes widened. He felt a disturbance in the normally soft current of the Force, a violent ripple as if a pebble had been thrown into a lake. A rather large pebble it must have been for the waves to reach the core, for Yoda felt whatever happened was still far, far away. It was of no less importance though. Danger. Darkness was ahead. Always remember that, you have to, he concluded his lesson. Always there the Force is, guiding you. But where light is, shadow also is not far. Beware of the dark side, you must. The younglings thanked him for the lesson and Yoda left the room. On his way to the council chamber, he met Mace Windu. One look into the eyes of the dark-skinned Jedi and Yoda knew that he had not been the only one to feel the disturbance. Rising, the darkness is, Yoda replied to the unasked question. How is that possible? Mace Windu asked, a frown marring his features. A disturbance of this magnitude. Several possibilities, there are, Yoda said as they made their way to the Jedi Council chambers together. The death of many, it could be. A natural catastrophe, maybe. Many places in many worlds there are where darkness is still strong. Unknown dangers freed from there could have been. At last it may be, that great pain, one of our brothers feels. He nodded. Mediate on this, I must. Of course, Windu knew exactly what he meant with those words. It might have been centuries since the Jedi Order had last encountered a Dark One, but not a week passed in which the Jedi, from youngling to master, did not mention the dark side in some sort of warning. After all, it was tempting each and every one of them daily, and on some days it was harder to ignore than on others. Windu felt a surge of guilt as he caught himself wishing that hopefully, the cause of this disturbance was a catastrophe that had cost many a life. The alternative could be so much more devastating in the long run. XXX. Senator Palpatine opened his eyes with a frown. Why, oh why couldn't he find the Dark One? He had immersed himself in meditation as soon as he could once he felt the disturbance in the Force. So far he was sure of three things. First, many people had died. Painfully. He didn't know exactly how many, but it was more than 50 and less than 200. 2. Whoever had killed them had done so using the dark side of the Force. Finally, he had felt no desperation and only little anger at the murders. This was not the feeling of a lost Jedi who had snapped under too much pressure or in a life-threatening situation. There was a feeling of purpose surrounding the source of the disturbance. The Dark One had known exactly what he did and he felt not a shred of regret. If he didn't know any better, he would say the person was experienced in using the dark side. Very experienced. But Palpatine did know better. He knew that the only person who could use the dark side with this level of expertise was himself. He knew that it wasn't Darth Maul, he was only just beginning learning about the Force. Also, Palpatine shared a bond with the boy, well, a boy compared to him anyway, and the feeling this new person was giving off was completely different. It was powerful. There was no other word to describe it, it felt like raw power being unleashed. The Sith Lord felt positively giddy at the thought. His current apprentice was little more than an assassin, but this Dark One. Oh, he would truly be worthy to stand by his side. The lack of desperation, however, was troubling. Only the most skillful of Sith were able to control the dark side with silent rage, with cold fury instead of burning hatred. To send such powerful waves of power through the galaxy and yet no emotions with it was almost unheard of. If the person was sociopathic and did simply not possess such strong emotions, Palpatine would have felt his descent into darkness in smaller steps, not in such an explosion. There was, however, no possibility that there was another Sith Lord around. His order lived by the rule of two. There could not be two fully trained Sith at the same time, and Palpatine had made sure to hunt down and kill any half-trained apprentices his own master had still had beside him. There could not be another Sith. And yet, getting the Dark One to join him could take some effort. He would have to find out what he wanted, what he craved, and make himself to be the only person who could give it to him. But first of all, he had to find him. Anakin watched, mouth open, jaw slack, as his father cut through the last remaining guards of Jabba the Hutt. The giant slug let out a stream of curses before grabbing one of his men, almost ripping his head off in the process, and took his blaster to aim at the raging demon himself. His father reflected the shot almost casually and sent it back in a precise line that hit Jabba's hand and knocked the weapon out of his grip. With a mighty jump, he was suddenly on the other side of the room. The bright red lightsaber, a lightsaber. Since when did his dad have one, let alone knew how to use it? That was almost as long as his father stood high, cut through 4 aliens in quick succession as he sprinted along the line. One last laser beam was reflected, and suddenly Jabba the Hutt stood alone in front of the vengeful spirit his dad had become. The slug let out a stream of words in Huttus, but this time they weren't curses. They were pleads. Anakin Vader strode towards him without hurry. Jabba made some kind of movement as if to grab him, but then his eyes became wide and he grabbed his own throat instead, struggling for air. When the lightsaber was finally pushed through, at least 30 different layers of fat in his body was sliced open from the base of his throat to the tip of his tail, organs and intestines, half burnt as soon as they touched the blade, oozing out like one big, disgusting mush. Anakin had to turn away and hold his hand in front of his mouth to keep his food down. That was for daring to touch Leia, he heard his father mutter as he gave the corpse one last kick. Faintly he asked himself who the heck Leia was, but he did not have much time to ponder about that as his father turned around. His normally brilliant blue eyes had taken on a frightening yellow. Anakin had thought he had been good at sneaking the last few paces to the room he'd heard fighting in. His father didn't look the least bit surprised to see him though. With a snap hiss, the giant red blade vanished. Still, Anakin couldn't keep his eyes away from the hilt of the weapon, even as his father strapped it back to his belt. Finally his dad came to stand in front of him. There was power radiating from him, but it was cold and uninviting and wrong, and he didn't like it. Anakin felt the stare of those yellow eyes on him, and for the first time since he had witnessed a former master whip his mother when he was 4, he felt fear. "Are you hurt?" the foreign man asked, because that was not his dad, it couldn't be. Anakin shook his head, unable to form words on his own. His father gave him one last piecing look as if he wanted to test if he was lying. Then he abruptly turned around and started walking. He had almost reached the end of the room, the door opening without anyone touching it, when he called over his shoulder. "What are you waiting for?" Anakin couldn't resist one last look around the room, at all those corpses and the body parts littered around, and there was a head in his way and he would have to take care not to stumble over it. Anakin took a deep breath and followed his father. He was afraid. He knew his dad wouldn't hurt him, at least, he hoped so, but he was still afraid. The prospect of staying in that room, of course, was a lot more frightening, and so he followed him. They walked side by side through the corridors. His dad seemed to know exactly where to go. Or maybe he was just following the trail of bodies. Because there were a lot of bodies. Several times Anakin had to climb over them when a group had searched for protection behind some obstacle or another. For a moment he thought about asking his father to carry him because there was blood on the solace of his shoes and he was leaving bloody footprints, but then he'd have to touch his father and he didn't think he was ready for that either. In turn, the man seemed to sense that and didn't offer. They didn't speak on their way out, even though Anakin had so many questions. Why was his father using a lightsaber? Wasn't that the weapon of the Jedi? Anakin had heard stories about the Jedi Knights, the peacekeeper of the galaxy. His mother had told him some, he'd heard customers talk about it, and sometimes even his father had mentioned them, through only in passing. His dad hadn't felt anything like a peacekeeping knight wielding that saber, through. He'd felt more like a devil straight from the deepest pits of heck. A terrible devil, yes, but he had done it to save him. Hadn't he? Anakin had wished for him to come and rescue him, and now here he was. He'd wished his father hadn't killed all those men. Or at least, that he didn't have to watch it. He knew that his father had killed people before in war, and even did now when hunting down criminals. These people here were nothing if not criminals. No, Anakin decided, it wasn't their deaths that disturbed him, horrible as they were. It was the fact that his father didn't look and act and speak like his father anymore. It was like he was an entirely different person. But at the same time he wasn't, because that darkness had always been there. He knew that cold edge in his features from when he talked to annoying customers. He knew that stiff posture from when he remembered the war. He knew that dark voice from when he scolded Anakin when he failed in his lectures. It was just that all of those little things at the same time made him so. Anakin. The single word had Anakin almost jumping out of his shoes. He only now noticed that they had left the palace and were back in the desert. Get in there. His father pointed towards a pod-shaped vehicle. For a moment, the boy's eyes widened. The pod was smooth and streamlined, equipped with the newest engines and painted in black with blue lighting coursing over the surface. It was beautiful and looked really fast and agile. In short, it was cool. Anakin was momentarily distracted by the vehicle, his passion for machines and racing surfacing and overcoming his fear. He hopped into the pod that was broader than usual to allow two people to sit in it, and couldn't resist moving his hands over the spotless surface of the custom-made racer. That was why he missed the giant explosion as Jabba's palace went up in a fireball. Anakin flinched at the noise, and then a second time as his father fell down into the pilot's seat next to him, handing him a helmet without saying anything. Anakin didn't take it though. He noticed that his eyes were blue once again, filled with grim satisfaction. They'll be after us, he finally managed to bring out. One of the reason nobody challenged the Hutts was because one of the very few things they valued above money were their family members. Tatooine wasn't the only planet where they had a significant influence, and not all of Jabba's men had been in that palace. Yes, they will, his father agreed calmly. Are we gonna be alright? Are you alright? Was what he really wanted to ask. Are we going to flee the planet? Will you be killed and Mom and I end up in slavery again? Anakin couldn't help but feel a spark of anger. If his dad was strong enough to take out so many people at once without being hurt even once, then surely he could have found a way to rescue Anakin without anyone noticing. If he had done that, then they wouldn't have to flee now. I will protect you, his father promised. Nothing will happen to you as long as I'm here. And that was his father talking again, his real father, and Anakin felt beyond relieved to hear that fierce protectiveness that he had learned to love so much about him. Anakin calmed down somewhat during the drive home. He was still stiff, but he was in a racer and the wind was blowing into his face and they were so fast and he just felt in his element. They slowed down as they reached the town, and Anakin managed to ask what happened to his friends. The Twi'lek should make it home safely, his father answered. Marvin died before I could get to him. That did feel like a punch to the stomach, but if he was honest, he had to admit that he had already expected something like that. It also made him realize that his father had saved more than just his freedom today. Jabba was the worst of the Hutts and certainly not known for his compassion towards slaves. Anakin wouldn't have survived long under his thumb, not with his current attitude. No, it didn't really matter to him what his father had done to those criminals in order to save him. He'd done what was necessary. No, not necessary. Not even fair or just, but But he'd done it for him, and Anakin couldn't help but feel a tiny spark of happiness that his father would go so far to save him. They had arrived at their house. That's a good racer, Anakin said somewhat lamely, just to fill the awkward silence as they got out of the pod. His father looked at him with a rare hint of surprise and, dare he hope, warmth. "It's yours," he said. Anakin stared. He was sure he hadn't heard right. "What?" His father shrugged. The gesture seemed strangely human and out of place for him. "It was supposed to be your birthday gift." His gaze wandered over the pod that Anakin knew at once he'd built himself. "I'm sorry I was so late." He didn't only mean the birthday. Anakin shook his head and stepped towards him. "It's okay," he muttered, and carefully, half expecting him to turn away, he wrapped his arms around his father, burrowing his face in his stomach. "Thank you," he whispered, choking on his tears. A second passed, then two, and then his father hugged him back, hesitant at first, then fiercely, lifting him up so Anakin's face was hidden in his brown curls instead, and carried him into the house. Anakin didn't stop sobbing until he was laid down in his bed. XXX. 3 days later. Darth Vader punched the coordinates into the navigator, preparing for the jump into hyperspace. Out of the corner of his eyes he glanced at Anakin. The boy was unusually quiet. So was Shmi, but his mother had never been a woman of many words. As soon as the morning dawned, Vader had taken his mother and younger self and taken them with him into his starfighter and up in space in less than an hour. They had to get away from that planet and from the countless Hutt henchmen hunting for them. It had taken a few days for the rumors to spread, but eventually things got out. Tatooine was no longer safe for them. Luckily both of them understood this and hadn't made any problems. Shmi was merely glad that both of her sons were back safely. She knew the danger wasn't over yet entirely, and so she tried her best not to be a bother, just sitting there quietly. It wasn't like there was much else for her to do. The starfighter was designed for a single pilot, there wasn't exactly much room to walk around. But Anakin, he had expected him to marvel at the stars, to wonder about the machinery, and to ask countless questions about how to pilot the starfighter. It was what he would have done at his age. Then again, the shock from what he'd seen yesterday was probably still shaking him. Vader hadn't planned for him to see it, but when he'd sensed his presence, he had not stopped either. Sooner or later Anakin would have to accept what he was, what he did. He would have to accept the choice he'd made. The only question was how much he would be forced to tell him to make him understand. "Where are we heading?" his mother finally asked quietly. "Malastare," Vader replied shortly. "Where is that?" Anakin asked, and then he added with a hint of anger, "Is that where we're going to live from now on?" "It's in the Middle Rim," Vader said, still calmly. "And no, we're not staying there for long. So that's what our life is going to look like from now on," Anakin muttered bitterly. "Always on the run." "Ani," Shmi scolded him sharply, and the boy ducked his head, but none of the defiance left his eyes. "I never run," Vader said darkly. "There is no need to." "Then where are we going?" Vader had to remind himself that Anakin was only 8. He was only a child, he had just lost a good friend and seen his first massacre. He was angry at his own helplessness, confused because his father wasn't who he'd thought he was, and to a certain degree, probably afraid of Vader too. He forced himself to remember that and to calm his own irritation. Everyone else who spoke to him like that, he would have in a chokehold by now. "Where do you want to go?" he asked instead. The navigator had finished calculating, but he didn't press the button yet. "What do you mean? If you could go anywhere, where would you want to go?" "To Tatooine," Anakin replied stubbornly. "It's dry and sandy and I don't like it, but it's my home and I don't like that we're being chased away from it. I always thought when I left the planet one day it would be my own decision, and now. Vader regarded him carefully, his mind brushing over Anakin's ever so slightly, judging his emotions and trying to find out what he really meant by that. trying to remember how he was at that age and what would have made him leave Tatooine on his own when the Jedi wouldn't have been the only way to get away from slavery. He realized it was the thought that someone was dictating his life, forcing him to do something without asking what he thought about it. That those people were criminals and after his blood only made it worse. The truth was, Anakin was upset because he hadn't gotten a choice. Darth Vader turned around again. The Vinta Harvest Classic is going to take place on Malastare in 2 days, he explained neutrally. The prize money together with the money I am going to bet on it will ensure I do not have to take any missions for at least 4 months. The majority of my enemies on Tatooine can be bribed with that money, the rest can be intimidated. We will return to Tatooine. Of course there would also be those he would have to kill. Vader had been busy the whole night hunting down a large part of Jabba's supporters, but there were still a few left. We are leaving the planet for a pod race, Shmi asked incredulously. But Anakin, don't tell me you want to race there yourself. I do, he replied shortly. Then he glanced back at his younger self. Except of course, if Anakin would like to. The boy looked surprised and through their bond, Vader caught a hint of excitement as well. Me? I know that you could win the race easily. And I did promise you I would take you to a race for your birthday. Yes, but to watch. How do you think you were able to secure a spot on the Bunta Eve this easily? Why do you think I built you that pod? I knew that you wanted to race. Vader felt the confusion, the shock, and then the pride, the elation rise through the bond. And then there was something else, some unidentified emotion. Gratitude perhaps? Happiness that his supposed father thought he could make it in such a big race? No. This went beyond that. It was tainted by sadness and a twinge of regret. Vader realized it was love. Love and forgiveness. Anakin had seen what he could do, the things he was capable of, and while he didn't like it he could not deny the bond that was forming between them, the inherent understanding they shared. He didn't know it yet, but their connection was deeper than that of father and son. They were, after all, the same person. Vader felt some of the stiffness leave his shoulders. He had worried a long time that maybe he had lost Anakin that night. That would have complicated things. The boy was important for his plans. He needed him to stay attached to him so that he would be able to influence his future. That's why he turned to Anakin, trying to smile in a comforting way, though it looked more like a grimace. I'm sorry for what you saw in the palace, son, he whispered. Let me make up for it. Anakin hesitated, and for the first time, Vader felt like it were his eyes trying to look to the bottom of his soul when usually he was the one with the intense glare. Okay, the boy whispered back, and Vader let out a breath. The Sith Lord reached forward and pushed a button. Promptly, the stars in front of them flashed brightly and the ship jumped to hyperspace. Vader was smiling, and this time, it was genuine. Anakin was becoming more like him every day. Everything was going according to plan. 2 minutes later Anakin was off exploring the ship. Hey Dad. Yes, son. Why is there a dead person in the rescue capsule? Crap. He had completely forgotten about it. XXX. Anakin won the Vinta Harvest. Of course he did, Vader had never expected anything else. He was slightly surprised though that he was the only one passing the finish line. Everyone else crashed or got atomized in a giant fireball. Shmi almost had a heart attack 3 times watching her son race head to head with Sebulba. Vader merely smiled nostalgically. With the considerable amount of money won, Vader brought enough parts to restore a freighter big enough so that his family could live on it comfortably for some time. Anakin slowly went back to his usual cheerful self when Vader gave him a piloting crash course and allowed him to fly the twin sun with Shmi while Vader took the starfighter back to Tatooine. When they arrived there, 1.5 weeks had passed since Anakin had gotten abducted. It was enough time so they didn't get shot down the moment they left their ships, but enough that Vader had to send his family ahead while he went to mutilate a couple of suspicious-looking guys waiting for them in a dark alley. Tell your friends this, he growled, choking the life out of the last man standing from a group of 5 with his bare hands. Jabba couldn't stop me with his whole army. If any of you try to attack me or my family again, there is not a single place in the galaxy where I won't find you. You're a dead man, the thug gasped. You and your family. The Hutts already sent someone else to take Jabba's place. They're after you. Where? Was all he asked. What? The new Hutt. Where is he? Why you're crazy? You can't take them on. Tatooine is my planet. From now on, I will be the highest authority here. The Hutts will bow for me or I will exterminate them. The man stared at him in shock. Who are you? He regarded the quivering man with cold, yellow eyes. I am Lord Vader. XXX. Yeah, so, who saw that coming? Jin Hanley, you're not the only weird person here. Anakin Skywalker, the future Sith Lord, is with you. Vatsi Iona 69, Vader taking over Tatooine was totally not planned. He was supposed to stay undercover for a little longer. But well, he's making a point not to follow the path laid out for him. He just came up to me, glaring at me with those creepy yellow eyes and made that strange hand gesture, and well, it appears I'm not immune to Jedi mind tricks, so next thing I knew, all the Hutts were dead. Confused face. 14 months later. Darth Vader stepped away from the twin sun, his dark traveling cloak flapping behind him just as his Sith cloak used to. Anakin was already running ahead of him, eager to see his mother again. The boy took no notice of the stares directed at him, the whispers and fearful looks sent their way. They were all directed at Vader, of course, but the Sith Lord had made it more than clear that anyone who even dared to do so much as look at his son or his mother the wrong way would soon find himself lacking a limb or two. Therefore, everyone hurried out of their way, even going so far as to drag other people with them that hadn't been on Tatooine long enough to learn about the new change in hierarchy. The planet had never really had an official government. The few policemen the Republic had sent here were so corrupt and intimidated by the general criminal population that they could easily pass as a part of them. Outwardly, Ramba the Hutt had taken Jabba's place in securing law and order, or rather, to control the criminal movement and smuggling around the solar system and the ascendant hyper routes. He was the third Hutt his clan had sent here. Vader had had to kill 2 of his cousins and a ridiculous amount of assassins and bounty hunters until the message finally got through to the giant slugs. Ramba had absolutely no intention to get on Vader's bad side. He even went so far as to officially introduce him as a lord and the head of the first noble house of Tatooine. During the first week, Vader had paid the slug a visit and told him in no uncertain words what he expected of him. Tatooine was his and he wanted to make sure Ramba knew who the highest authority was. Vader himself had neither the means nor the intention to establish himself as a sole ruler over the planet. He was content letting the Hutts continue to do all the work, but there were a few things he wanted to have changed. For once, there was to be no more slavery. This demand was the one he had failed with the last Hutt. After all, slavery was their favorite punishment. With Ramba he had reached a compromise. The slave transmitters would be disposed of and the slaves would be officially free but still have a department to pay off. The amount was set by the Hutts for males, females, and children and no longer depended on their talents. The slaves had to receive payment. It had to be enough so they could get food, water, and shelter. That meant that most slaves would never be able to pay off their department, but it also meant that if they got a rich friend he could pay it off for them and the owners would not be able to refuse to take the money. Murder, violence, and thievery was now to be punished with penalties, to be paid within half a year. With greater crimes the department was usually high enough so the person would be forced to work like the slaves used to. Alternatively to paying the price, one could also sacrifice a limb. Running away without paying counted as making this choice. Vader got a twisted kind of amusement out of the fact that those criminals would later have to come to his shop, since he offered the best prosthetics. It was one of his specialties after all. He made sure they were expensive enough that you could just pay your fine as well though. Once these things were taken care of, Vader had taken to traveling the galaxy together with Anakin. They had modified their initial ships so the starfighter and freighter could form a unit that made traveling together easier and allowed the smaller ship to function as a shuttle. Anakin was quite proud of his twin Sunday. He had modified it plenty of times with Vader providing help and suggestions. Still, he had insisted they rent different kinds of spacecraft all over the galaxy so his son learned to fly with them as well. Their everyday life looked like this. Vader would choose a new target from the list of wanted men of the Republic, or in rarer cases take a job for Ramba. They would either fly to the planet the target had last been sighted at or search along the exciting points of the hyper routes. If they were in space, Vader would use the opportunity to teach his son about space fighting and battle strategy. If they had to search on a planet, Anakin got to choose whenever he wanted to stay on the ship to tinker with it or go on sightseeing until Vader had hunted down the target. Sometimes he let the person fight against Anakin, promising to let him go if he managed to defeat the boy. That way Anakin could train his hand-to-hand combat as well as how to increase his speed, stamina, and reflexes with the Force. Even so, there were large amounts of time when they both had nothing to do. Vader took care not to take any missions from people who wanted to contact him directly. Instead, they just patrolled the places criminals liked to hide out at and called themselves lucky if they spotted someone with a bounty on him. Vader always delivered his prisoners to different planets, turning them over to the Republic authorities so his face would not be remembered. A couple of times they had been ambushed by revenge-seeking mercenaries or other hunters trying to take out the competition. Darth Vader made short work with them. He never got any attackers worth a challenge, simply because he was remaining under the radar. He didn't cause enough trouble for the really dangerous foes to notice him. Whenever they had free time, Vader would teach Anakin about the Force. After what happened with Jabba, he had told him what it really was he meant when he talked about trusting your instincts or feeling the energy around him. The Force exists everywhere, it surrounds us and holds the world together, he had explained, remembering his early Jedi days. It exists in everyone, but only few people can feel it. These people are called Force sensitive. That's what you and I are. Are there many people like us? Anakin had asked curiously. There are only a couple of them per planet in each generation. Those that are born in the Outer Rim often never learn how to use the Force. What about the others? The Jedi Order is searching systematically for Force sensitives to train them from a young age. Then there are a handful of people, Jedi who left their order, have never finished their education or been banned for using the dark side that travel around on their own. Sometimes those take apprentices too. Then of course the inevitable question came, what is the dark side? It is a part of the Force that is different. When the light side, the one the Jedi use and the one you have learned to use in your training to make yourself stronger or faster, is like a vast desert, then the dark is like the deep sea. You have to establish a connection to the light through hard work and much meditation. It is like planting a seed in the dry sand, it will take a long time for the soil to give you anything in return. When it does, however, the flow is steady and strong as long as you maintain it well. The dark, however, is a bottomless pit. It will give you everything you ask for immediately if you feed it, and it will always return to you, asking for more. How can you feed the Force? It's not like it has a body. The dark side is always hungry for emotions. The light is full and content, you have to coax it patiently to give you what you want, and it demands you trust it and let it guide you in return. During mediation, a light side user feeds his emotions into the Force to reach inner peace. He needs this because using the Force requires his full concentration. It is, however, very hard to feed intense emotions into it. Look at it like the difference between a fat house cat and a starved dog. The dark side will always take all of the emotions you offer it and give you power in return. Along with it, it will give you an echo of those feelings, like a farmer fertilizing his plants. But isn't the dark side, evil? Darth Vader had shaken his head at that. I can tell from your words that you are still very much a child. The dark side is dangerous, both for the person you use it against and for yourself, but if you know how to handle it, it is merely a powerful tool. For example, say you feel annoyance at somebody because he rammed your ship while you are traveling through space, minding your own business. If you feed this annoyance into the light side, it will vanish. The Force will tell you if it was an accident or an attack, and you may dismiss it if it was harmless. If you feed the same feeling into the dark side, it will return an echo of anger to you, causing you to attack the offender in revenge. It is different with more intense emotions. If someone were to hurt your mother, you might feel not only anger but an intense rage and fear for her. It is very hard to feed such feelings into the light side. In the middle of a fight it will be impossible, and if you cannot clear your mind, your connection to the light side will lessen and you will be severely weakened, maybe even unable to protect her. At the same time, the dark side will be baited to you through your intense emotions. If you fuel your rage into it, you will receive its power and you will receive an echo of anger. But this anger will be less potent than the rage you had previously. The danger of the dark side lies in 2 points. 1. This echo will no longer be connected to the source of your original rage. It may cause you to attack whoever is trying to hurt your mother, but you might forget to secure her safety first, losing her anyway. 2. When the dark side surrounds you, attracted by your emotions, you feel the power it could give you in every fiber of your body, but you don't actually possess it yet. You feel confident, as if you could do anything, but what you feel is merely the promise of the dark. Your rage will rise and rise because it makes you feel powerful, but unless you release these feelings into the Force, you will not actually receive any power in return. You have to find this point where your emotions are at its highest and then let them all go. It is not a hard thing to do, since the dark is eager to swallow them up, but if you forget to do it at all, you will severely overestimate your power. This had been Vader's downfall on Mustafar, and he had taken years to figure it out. Now of course he didn't receive any echo from the dark side anymore, and neither did the light side ask that he trust in its guidance in exchange. Anakin didn't have that advantage. The more emotion you feed into the Force, regardless of which side, the easier it will come to you. The light side is easier to handle but takes more time, which is why I am teaching it to you. You are still very young, you can afford to wait. Once you start using the dark side, it will come to you easier and more often, even if you do not want it. That is why one should think carefully before using it. You are using the dark side, Anakin had immediately concluded, aren't you? That's right, Vader had said calmly. He had taken care to keep an eye on the bond, to judge Anakin's reaction. He might be his adopted son, but revealing yourself as a Sith should never be done light-hearted. Will I have to use it too? That was when Vader had pulled the boy towards him, had laid both hands on his shoulders and looked into his eyes and said very seriously, "Listen, Anakin, and listen well, because this is important. I will never force you to use the dark or the light if you do not want to. I will never force you to fight a battle when you do not believe it is the right thing to do. I will show you a way and give you advice what to do based on what I think is best for you, but if you do not agree with me, all you have to do is tell me so. In return, I ask that you accept how I choose to live my life. I ask that if you are in trouble and your life or the life of people you love is in danger, that you come to me for help. Regardless of how much time passes or if I'm happy with the choices you made in life or not, I want you to trust me that I will always help you and your family. Do you think you can do that?" Anakin had nodded slowly and allowed Vader to hold him. "I love you, Dad. I love you too, Anakin, you and your mother. That is part of the reason why I have chosen to remain with the dark." "What do you mean?" "I mean that I do not even for a single second, want to release this love for my family into the light side and have it just vanish. I do not think that I could, even if I tried, but if I did succeed, I would no longer be the same. I would no longer be me. He would be a puppet, lifeless and cold just like the Jedi." "I understand," Anakin had said, and Vader knew that it was the truth. Now that Vader didn't have to tiptoe around the topic anymore, he was free to teach a lot more things to the boy. He always warned him to use it in a fight that would leave witnesses though. Since everyone Vader had ever killed or mutilated was a criminal and thus would either not tell on him or everybody would believe it was in self-defense, he never really broke any laws, and of course, neither did Anakin. The Jedi, however, he explained, had a great fear for anything even remotely dark, and he wouldn't put it past them to break the law by attacking them for using the dark side alone. But the Jedi are supposed to keep order and peace, Anakin had protested. Why would they attack us? It is because a few hundred years ago, the Jedi were at war with the Sith Order. Sith are Force users that use the dark side exclusively and strive to oppose the Jedi in everything they do. Their most important goal is to destroy the Jedi Order. Jedi believe the Sith to be extinct, but there is always a possibility of a Jedi falling to the dark and taking on this name again. Wait, but if you are using the dark side, doesn't that make you a Sith? Yes and no. The Sith, by definition, are opposing the Jedi. I prefer to stay with your mother and you, to make sure you are safe instead of plotting how to take down the Jedi. Also, the Sith live by the rule of two. There is always one master and one apprentice, not more. I am fully trained in the dark side, and so the Jedi would consider me a Sith, but at the same time, I am not part of the Sith Order, since I do not live by their rules. I'm glad that you don't, Anakin had declared. Otherwise you would have never come to free us. That is right. However, it also means that both orders, Sith and Jedi alike, are now after my blood. They will be after you too, to use you against me or to get you to join them, since you are becoming quite powerful yourself. I don't want to be in the Sith Order, Anakin had muttered with a shiver. They sound scary. I wouldn't mind becoming a Jedi, if they weren't hunting you. Vader hadn't known wherever to be insulted or amused. Nobody is hunting me, he had empathized. I know you do not have much of a comparison, but I can tell you that I am quite powerful. I am more powerful than the current Sith Master and more powerful than the Grand Jedi Master. I have no need to run and no need to hide. If I wanted to, I could destroy the Jedi, take over the Intergalactic Republic and declare myself Emperor. In fact, he had played with that thought in the beginning. Then why don't you? Anakin had asked, clearly amused. If you're so powerful, why did you remain on a dust ball where low-life smugglers and criminals are bothering you instead of taking over the world? Because, Anakin, that is where your mother and you wanted to stay, and I wanted to stay with you. Besides, I did take over that dust ball once I got tired of criminals bothering me, if you remember. Anakin had been quiet after that. The two Anakins had reached their house in Mos Espa, and the smaller one immediately rushed in, searching for his mother. Mom! Mom, we're back again! Shmi appeared from the doorway of the kitchen, smiling at them both warmly. Welcome home! How was your trip? It was fun. We were on Alderaan and Dad showed me the ocean. It's like a desert made from water. I have never seen so much water. I wish you could have seen it. That's sweet of you, Ani, but you know I don't like flying too much. Though it must have been a beautiful sight. Did you watch the sunset? Not really. Vader had to hide a smile. He never really understood what was supposed to be so great about sunsets. He saw two of them every day, and it only meant that the night and with it the freezing cold would come. But guess what? Dad bought me a second hyperdrive for the twin sun. Oh no, was the old one damaged? Shmi always worried when they told her how they'd gotten into a space fight. With the result that they generally avoided telling her about it. Well no, it's a spare hyperdrive. A spare? But isn't that the thing that makes a ship go really fast? I thought they were expensive. Vader let out a sigh. Yes, it is that part. You cannot imagine how many times I wished I had a spare hyperdrive in my ship in the past. It is the first thing you always attack as soon as you manage to bring down the shield generator so your opponent cannot flee into hyperspace. You should always have a spare hyperdrive on board, his younger self said, nodding and doing his best to look important, even though he was quoting the explanation Vader had given him before. It's common sense. Well, I will trust you on these matters, Shmi said. Vader had contacted her shortly before they entered the atmosphere, so she had dinner prepared for them already. Anakin continued to tell his mother of their journey to Alderaan. Vader leaned back and was content to enjoy watching them. In the beginning Anakin had merely been his younger self, someone he had to protect so his children would be born, but ultimately just a tool for him. With time he understood that he could not push Anakin around forever. He was still convinced that he knew what was best for both of them, but the boy might not agree with him if he didn't tell him the whole truth. If he did, he might react just like Luke had initially and refuse to have anything to do with him. No, Anakin would have to be coaxed into fulfilling his role slowly. Vader had learned enough about the subtle art of manipulation from Sidious to know how to handle the boy. Of course it helped that he always knew exactly what happened in his head. All he had to do is remember how he was at that age. The irony that he was doing to his younger self the same thing he had loathed the Jedi and Sith alike for when it had been done to him, was not lost on him. But of course it wasn't the same thing, since Anakin's and his goals were essentially the same, or would be, as long as he kept the timeline relatively intact. Vader would not force Anakin to follow in his footsteps, and neither would he make him become a Jedi if he didn't want to, but he did insist that he at least see both sides before he decided to join one. Only when he thought his actions were his own idea would he follow his lead. Vader needed him to stay ignorant, at least until he was able to reveal the full truth to him. He couldn't do that as long as there was still a chance he would come across a random Jedi, or Sith, who could pick the knowledge from his still untrained mind. Anakin was still very much like him, childish and reckless when at home, like he had been at that time, but serious and mature during his training, like Vader had been during his Jedi days. At the same time, he was beginning to develop his own personality. He lacked the cynical bitterness Vader had adopted after the Jedi forbade him from returning to Tatooine to free his mother. He wasn't as paranoid of strangers as Vader had been during to his experiences as a slave, confident that none of them posed a threat to him. He had begun to start seeing shades of grey between the black and white Vader had believed in as a child. Anakin did not have to worry about earning enough food or being punished for failures. He was free to strive for a higher purpose, and he was determined to impress both Shmi and Vader. This new shift could eventually pose a problem if it hindered his ability to predict his actions. When he was in doubt, well, their bond was now strong enough that he didn't have any problems driving into Anakin's mind. He had done so several times when helping him with his meditation. Also, Vader had planted knowledge into his son's mind concerning foreign languages and basic history about the places they visited. As a Jedi Padawan, Vader had had to learn all of this on his own, and he had always thought it a terrible waste of time when Kenobi could have just shared the knowledge through their bond. There were so many more important things to learn, practical, more useful things. Surprisingly, the one thing Vader had been able to teach Anakin, which he himself had never really excelled in, was discipline. It was in their nature to go against rules, to fight for their freedom and anyone who wanted to oppress them. Kenobi, who had known that Vader was a very emotional person, had always punished him by ordering him to mediate so he may free himself from his impatience. The only thing it had done was to frustrate him further. That was why now Vader had taken a different approach. He would simply refuse to train Anakin in the Force if he did not obey. He would still teach him mechanics and flying. The boy would still have fun, so it wouldn't feel like punishment. At the same time, his progress in his Force training, which Anakin was so proud of, would suffer. Vader explained that the Force required one to have self-control, and the best way to learn it was through discipline. It really only was a matter of motivation. Ever since Vader had promised he'd help Anakin to build his first lightsaber, undoubtedly it wouldn't be the last, not if he had Vader's knack for loosing weapons. To his next birthday, if he behaved, he hadn't had any problems. In the beginning, he had chosen this method merely to make sure Anakin would learn the most in the least amount of time. That it also made him more compliant was a nice bonus. As a Jedi, Vader had often rebelled against Kenobi because he thought his master was holding him back. Vader taught Anakin many things that no Padawan his age would have dared to try, but he also insisted they go back to the very basics during their warm-up. Anakin thought it was to strengthen his body or his connection to the Force, when really the reason was that his form wasn't perfect yet. The Jedi would have let him practice on the same thing for months to no end before teaching him something new, while Vader knew that he would remember the lesson best if he practiced it over a longer time, but with the occasional feeling of success and progress from being deemed ready to learn something new. He could afford to teach him this way since he rarely ever allowed Anakin to go against real opponents, and Anakin did not recognize his strategy since he had no way to compare his skills to other children his age. "Do you know where you want to go next?" Shmi asked, startling Vader from his thoughts. 3 years ago this wouldn't have been possible, but his new, peaceful lifestyle had made even him relax. Of course it was only in the presence of those two that he could drop the mask of the unrelenting Sith Lord, but it was more than he'd had in 2 decades. "We will stay on Tatooine for a couple of weeks," he explained. "I thought it was time for Anakin to learn how to handle money. I would like him to manage the droid shop on his own for this time." In truth, Vader knew that soon, Qui-Gon Jinn, Kenobi and his Padme, no, not his this time, but oh he wished she were, would arrive on Tatooine. It was important that Anakin met them. The boy didn't know any of that. Vader had simply offered him several options on how he could prove that he was capable of handling his own money. He had promised him more pocket money if he could make some profit at the end of it. Also he had made it deliberately that from all the options, the work at the droid shop would be the most appealing. Was he manipulating his son? Yes, he probably was. Was that the way of the Sith? Definitely. Still, Vader didn't regret it all. His actions would lead Anakin on the way of love and happiness after all. Even if the worst case happened and he fell again, Vader would prefer having to go through all that pain again to never knowing what love and friendship felt like. "There is something else," Shmi said. Well, I got a job offer." "What kind of job offer?" Vader wanted to know immediately. "It's from Caldia the Hutt, Ramba's mate. She offered me a position as an overseer in their software team." While Anakin was a genius in everything to do with hardware, Shmi had always been better with software. With the help of C-3PO, who could translate even the most abstract machine languages for her, she could find her way around any system. In fact, he had sometimes contacted her to help him hunt down a target by hacking into the Republic databases or the more hidden networks where bounty hunters exchanged information. Nonetheless, he knew that Shmi's talents were not the reason the job had been offered to her. It was Ramba's attempt to secure the delicate understanding he had reached with Vader. "Do you want to take the job?" he asked. "Well, they do pay really well. If Ami takes over the shop for the next couple of weeks, it will give us time to employ someone. But I'm not stupid either. I know that I would basically be a hostage. Standing behind the counter just selling things must be boring for his mother. The position would fit her and she would have the protection from the Hutts against enemies Vader had made outside. The Hutts know my name. I had never problems with the current ones before, and I doubt that I will in the future. If you take the job, make sure to tell Ramba that I will terminate his entire clan if something happens to you. It should keep him in line. Also, demand that you can leave whenever you want without questions asked." Shmi did not know much about what Vader did in his free time, but she wasn't blind. She knew he was behind Jabba's death, and she also knew that the periodical, severe decrease in the Tusken population coincided with the times Vader returned from a trip. At one point she had tried to talk to him about it. Vader had given her a tiny glimpse of what was to come, the war that was going to break loose, and how he needed his position on Tatooine to be secure. Shmi did not approve, but she believed that Vader did all this to protect his family, and so she stopped arguing with his methods. "Do you know yet what you would like to do one day?" Shmi asked Anakin with a soft smile. "Well..." Anakin pushed around the food on his plate. "I don't really know yet. I could imagine being a pilot, I guess. But I don't want to be a smuggler. I don't really want to work for the Federation either. They sound like a bunch of greedy cowards. I think I would like more action." Shmi and Vader exchanged a look. "There are plenty of planets in the Middle Rim and the core worlds that have their own fleet of spaceships," Vader said. "Of course the Navy of the Republic doesn't have much to do in peaceful times. especially not with a Senate that moronic and slow. But they do send regular patrols to hunt down smugglers and pirates. Anakin, Shmi said with a scowl, for once glaring at the older man. I would not feel well knowing my son was part of an army. That work is dangerous. Not more dangerous than staying on Tatooine would be, young Anakin replied. Shmi opened her mouth for another retort and Vader leaned back with a smile, content to watch the two banter. He did not believe for one moment that Anakin would end up in the navy of some random planet. XXX. We don't have enough energy to get to Coruscant. The hyperdrive is damaged. Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn listened to the report of the captain. He was relieved that they had broken through the blockade around Naboo, but apparently it had been a blessing in disguise. We have to land and repair the ship, he thought aloud. His Padawan, Obi-Wan Kenobi, had already finished checking their options before his master had even stopped speaking. Here, Master. Tatooine is small, far away and rather poor. The Federation doesn't have any influence on it. How can you be sure of that? A crew member asked. When his master wouldn't answer, Obi-Wan said, it is controlled by the Hutts. You can't take the Queen there, the Hutts are criminals. Even worse, Qui-Gon muttered, the head of clan of the Hutts on that planet changed 3 times in the last 2 years. They still rule over the planet, but something is causing them great trouble. Unfortunately, we don't have much of a choice. The danger isn't any different if we landed on a planet controlled by the Federation. At least the Hutts and whatever else is on that planet are not searching for us. This will give us an advantage. The rest of the crew eventually agreed with the plan. The 2 Jedi went to tell the Queen of the change of plans. Master, do you have an idea what's going on Tatooine? Obi-Wan wanted to know. I'm afraid news from the Outer Rim are scarce, the older Jedi replied. It is only because the death of Jabba the Hutt caused an uprising with the entire race that spread over several systems that I heard of it. What will we do if we encounter the source of this tumult? Qui-Gon smiled slightly. Young Padawan, just because we are going to a place that holds a hidden danger or two does not automatically mean that we are going to encounter it. Obi-Wan stopped at that, staring aghast after his master, who simply continued his trek unperturbed. Really, Master? The young man called after him. Do you really believe that? Because he didn't. The 2 Jedi had a history of stumbling over adventures and making simple missions unnecessarily complicated. More often than not, this was due to Qui-Gon's habit of picking up primitive life forms, like that moronic Gungan. Obi-Wan couldn't help himself, he had a really bad feeling about this. XXX. I'm sorry about the strange formation in the last chapter. I'm afraid I don't really know what went wrong, I just copy-pasted everything as usual. I hope this chappie gets through better. Fies, I really like it when people take their time to review this elaborately. It's silly to expect a new reader to comment every chapter separately, it's just as great if you talk some more in a longer rev, that way I can really feel you liked my fanfic. I agree with you about the Empire being not all bad, I mean, the people practically chose it themselves anyway. Sidious rule was totally legal. I doubt I'll manage to build it up the way it was before, but Vader will cause some major chaos in the galaxy, of that I can assure you. The main reason why I wanted to have both Vader and Anakin in the story was because I actually like both of them, but writing about them as the same person would make him look like a psychopath with a split personality. Now wait, that's a nice idea for another FF. Jin Hanley, I don't think there's anyone in the galaxy who doesn't hate Jabba. I mean, he's, ugh. Yet the Jedi never kill him. They even deal with him frequently, just as they sometimes work with the pirates. Hypocrites. In my opinion, hunting down those kinds of criminals would be one of Vader's main jobs while in the Empire, since the rebellion took around 5 years to form, I think, and even then they weren't a big threat until the end. I am a little confused why Tatooine wasn't the first planet to be cleansed by Vader, but then again, maybe he just had too many bad memories of that planet and didn't want to go near there. Now that he has to live there again, it is only logical that he would go after the Hutts at some point. About for it. I'll be honest here, I had totally forgotten about him myself. It was only after reading about the chapter to check for spelling mistakes that I noticed that he would. Last year we went to Malastare and I flew in the Vinta Harvest Classic. I'm the first human who ever won it. Qui-Gon listened with no small amount of incredulity as the small boy retold the tale of his victory to the handmaiden. What kind of parents would let their son race such a dangerous event? For that matter, what kind of parents would let a 9-year-old run his own droid shop? Yet the boy did not look stressed, afraid or abused. In fact, he seemed to have a great deal of fun leading the small group through the storage rooms, a droid rolling behind them and picking up this part and that when his master pointed it out. It seems you know a lot about these machines. Since when do you work here? The girl, Qui-Gon, though he remembered her name was Padme, asked the small boy. I took over the shop 2 weeks ago. It belongs to my mother, but I helped out a lot before too. My father taught me all about piloting and repairing things. He must have a lot of confidence in you when he allows you to lead the shop by yourself, the Jedi said. Oh, this is nothing. It's actually boring most of the time. I could imagine your work to become quite dangerous at times, Padme noticed. Some of these parts must be very expensive. Aren't you afraid someone might try and break in? The boy, Anakin Skywalker, that was how he had introduced himself, laughed at that. I want to see the fool who tries to rob this shop. He grinned confidently and pointed towards a black, nondescript box on top of a high shelf. Over there we store our droid Ekis. All of them are fully functional and will attack when the alarm goes off or I give them a signal. Droid Ekis, the Jedi echoed, alarm bells ringing. How many of those do you have here? Why, do you want to buy them? The smart boy didn't let anything on. It was a droid shop, so Qui-Gon supposed it wasn't all that uncommon that they would have a droideka. But those battle robots were highly advanced, and with their laser cannons and shield reactors they could pose a threat even to the Jedi. Also the droids were very expensive, and Qui-Gon couldn't imagine that a small shop on this desert planet would offer one, much less several. I can't imagine you being a fan of combat droids, Anakin mused, watching Qui-Gon with a critical eye. Why do you say that? The boy shrugged. You come for a new hyperdrive, so you probably just fled a fight. You hold yourself with confidence, so you're not afraid of the less than nice people around. You always watch out for Padme and the Gungan. You are their protectors, so you know how to fight, but you fight more often on the ground than in a ship. Otherwise you would have a spare hyperdrive with you, or at least a technician in your crew who could repair it. Still, you don't wear any armor and you can't be hiding more than one blaster under your clothes. I think this means you are more used to weaponless fighting. That, or... Anakin stopped and looked up to him. Qui-Gon met his gaze and was for a moment startled by the intense look in those blue eyes. That or you're a Jedi. Both Qui-Gon and Padme stared at the boy in shock. The Jedi felt a sudden vibe in the Force, a warning to pay close attention to this boy. There was more to him than met the eye. Either he was a genius to have uncovered his disguise this easily, or, and this was a truly frightening thought, he had experience in combat and space fighting. He sent a silent prayer to the Force that it was the first. It would sadden him greatly if such a young boy would have had to experience combat enough times to recognize a trained fighter that anyone else would mistake for a harmless civilian. If even half of what he'd said was true, it might also be possible that the child was Force sensitive. He would very much like to test the boy, but he didn't think there was any way to do it without drawing suspicion. The awkward silence was abruptly broken by a loud crash when Jar Jar, who had wandered off alone, fell into a bunch of spare parts after freeing his long tongue from where it had somehow gotten stuck in the compartment of a vaporizer. I have never heard that anyone, even experienced commanders, take a spare hyperdrive with them, Qui-Gon replied in an attempt to distract the boy when he helped the Gungan back to his feet. Anakin merely wrinkled his nose. Why wouldn't they? It's only common sense to have a spare hyperdrive. If you have the money, I could give you two. I have 20,000 credits, the Jedi said, confident that it was enough to cover the cost. Though he doubted they would need the second hyperdrive. You can't pay with credits on Tatooine, Anakin said. They aren't worth anything here. I'm afraid we don't have any local currency. Oh. Well, that's a shame then. Another awkward silence. Qui-Gon threw a meaningful look at the girl next to him. Anakin had obviously taken a liking to her, maybe she could change his mind. Padme seemed to have understood because she asked. Are you sure you can't make an exception? Anakin looked to his feet, then to Jar Jar, back to the door, anywhere but to the beautiful handmaiden. Well. You see, I'm supposed to prove that I can handle my own money and business here. Some of the other parts on your list I could probably repair for you, but I can't just let you take the hyperdrive. We understand, Qui-Gon said, unable to keep the disappointment entirely out of his voice. Is there maybe another store where we could buy it? Anakin shook his head. No, I'm the only one around here who can give you advanced stuff like that. Then we are in a lot of trouble. Padme sighed. More awkward silence. Am I right? Anakin suddenly wanted to know. Are you a Jedi, sir? Qui-Gon hesitated. They needed the help of this boy or they would be stuck on this planet for a very long time. There was something special about him, but the Force did not warn him from any danger. Also, his good heart refused to believe that such a brilliant, nice if somewhat overconfident young boy could have ill will towards them. It is true, he admitted. I am a Jedi Master. We're on the way to Coruscant on a very important mission and cannot afford to lose any time. Anakin was silent at that for a moment, lost in thought. I want to help you, he decided, but I would have to ask my father if it's all right to sell you the hyperdrive for credits. We often make trips to other planets together, so it's not like we couldn't use it, but he was very clear in that I only take Whoopie Uppie to keep the shop running. It would be a great help to us if you could do that, Padme said with a smile. Anakin smiled back brightly and Qui-Gon had to hide a chuckle when the boy went to make his call. 5 minutes later he was back. Can you tell me where your ship is now? It's a short walk away from the town in the south. Why? There's a sandstorm brewing and those can become really dangerous here. I don't think you're going to make it. If you don't have any other shelter, you're in trouble. Dad said I shall invite you to stay with us for the night and he will think about the deal. The two humans exchanged a look. We would not want to impose on you, Padme said. Oh no, it would be great having you over. I'm sure if you tell him your story he will agree to help you too. You know, he probably just wants to see you to make sure you don't have a bounty on your head. I can't sell spare parts to fugitives he might have to hunt down later. Then your father is a bounty hunter. This was getting more problematic with every second. Qui-Gon was pretty sure that by now the Federation had put a nice bounty on the Queen's head. More like a freelancer. We search for people from the Republic Most Wanted list. As a Jedi in a town full of criminals, you're probably safest with us. Qui-Gon closed his eyes for a moment, his mind connecting to the Force to help him make a decision. Curiously, however, he received no gentle hum, no nudge in the right direction. The Force did not give him any incentive. Very well, we will accept your generous invitation, he finally decided himself. Anakin was happy to hear it. It was almost time to close the shop anyway, so he took them with him right away. Anakin and his family lived in a house in the middle of the town. It wasn't very big, but when they entered they could see that the furniture was a high quality. They had electrical lights instead of the lamps most people on Tatooine used, and the fabrics of the dress the black-haired woman who greeted them at the door was soft cotton instead of the rough linen they saw on the street. Hello Ami, I hope your day was great, the woman, obviously Anakin's mother, said warmly. Your father already told me you were bringing friends. Please, do come in. Qui-Gon, Padme, and Jar Jar thanked her and they were ushered into the dining room. There, Anakin told her about the problem. Watching them interact, it was obvious their relationship was very good. Soon Mrs. Skywalker left them alone again to prepare dinner. "It never becomes boring with you, doesn't it, son? Bringing a Jedi into my house." Qui-Gon turned around to see a tall man in his late 20s, brown curls framing his face, a prominent scar running over one of his intense blue eyes. He wore tight leather trousers and a vest over a dark grey long-sleeved shirt. Several small bags could be seen on his belt as well as an empty holster. As a hunter, it was probably reserved for a blaster or another weapon. Qui-Gon looked at Anakin, who merely shrugged, signaling that he had not been the one to tell his father that he was a Jedi. Qui-Gon stood and gave the men, presumably Anakin's father, a slight bow before he introduced himself and his friends. "We are grateful that you have offered us shelter for the night in light of the storm outside," he concluded. The man regarded him coldly for a couple of seconds before he merely nodded. Then, completely ignoring the Jedi Master, he turned to the girl, "Padme. My name is Anakin Vader. I am pleased to make your acquaintance, milady. My home is your home, so please do not hesitate to ask if you need something." "Oh," Padme said, surprised by his manners. She had not expected something like this on Tatooine. "Thank you very much, Mr. Vader. Your help is greatly appreciated. Please, call me Anakin. A friend of my little junior is my friend as well." "Dad," the little junior whined, and Padme chuckled. "I don't know what you are even doing here. Shouldn't you be helping your mother with dinner?" Vader scolded the boy, who huffed indignantly but stood to leave for the kitchen. His expression brightened, however, when Padme offered to come with him and help as well. The kitchen and dining room were connected through an open doorway, so they could still see each other and, more importantly, they could see Jar Jar, who had discovered the secret store of pans and kettles and was making quite some noise with them. Vader sat down opposite of Qui-Gon and didn't leave the Jedi out of his sight for even a single second. He was being watched as if the hunter was afraid he would decide to go and murder his family any moment. It was more than a little disconcerting, since Qui-Gon felt if he moved even a little he would be shot down immediately. Again the Jedi concentrated on the flow of the Force around them. It was tense, but he could feel no ill intent with this man, only an unhealthy amount of paranoia. Qui-Gon cleared his throat. "Well, Anakin, I must congratulate you for such a nice son," he said. "For you, it is Lord Vader," the hunter snapped immediately. "I am the head of the most influential family on this planet, and you will pay me the proper respect, Jedi." Slightly taken aback, Qui-Gon leaned away from Vader instinctively. He didn't sound aggressive per se, but this man was clearly used to giving commands and seeing them being followed. Something in Qui-Gon balked at the idea of bowing his head to this arrogant and quite rude man, wondering how he could be so polite to Padme and yet change his behavior entirely once the women were out of range. But unfortunately, this man seemed to be the only one willing and capable of helping them. Qui-Gon had never heard that Tatooine had a noble house, but if it was true, his request was sensible. "Of course, please forgive me, Lord. I meant no disrespect. Your son, Anakin Skywalker, was it? May I ask why he carries your surname but his mother's last name?" In hindsight, that may not have been the smartest thing for him to ask to distract the prideful hunter. "Shmi and I are not married," he replied through gritted teeth. "Though I fail to notice what it is to you. I was merely curious, that is all." Vader watched him silently for a couple of seconds as if to gauge the honesty of his words. Finally he replied, "The romantic part of our relationship was very short, if it existed at all. Anakin was 6 when I saw her again. Both of them were slaves and I freed them and took them in. My love for Shmi has been platonic ever since." Something about that story sounded off. When Shmi came in shortly after with the dinner, he paid close attention to the way they all interacted with each other. It was clear in the way the woman treated them that she loved both Anakins very much. The way the boy bragged about his accomplishments during the day, it was also clear that he craved his father's attention and wanted to impress him. Occasionally Vader would send them both a small smile and he started a conversation with his son about the best way to take apart a shield generator, but overall he was very reserved during the meal. Qui-Gon couldn't help but think that he had something against Jedi. He couldn't think of any reason why though. If it was true that he was one of these bounty hunters limiting themselves to Republic fugitives, he shouldn't have anything to fear from official agents such as the Jedi. Even if he did, Qui-Gon clearly needed his help at the moment and was unlikely to ask too many questions. Soon the food was cleared away and Vader inquired about the mission that had led them here. Qui-Gon kept his answers vague. He half expected the hunter to ask further questions, but it never got that far. "Ah!" Anakin suddenly cried out, staring at his hand. He'd accidentally cut himself with a knife while preparing some fruit. "Oh Ani, what have you done?" Shmi asked, concerned as she took his hand in hers. There was a shallow but surprising long cut on his finger that was oozing blood. "I don't know, the knife just slipped from my hand," Anakin complained. "There is a medical kit in the cupboard behind you, Jedi, if you would," Vader said. "That's not necessary," the boy complained, but Qui-Gon had already found the kit. He was actually quite eager for the opportunity to clean the small wound of the boy. It did give him the chance to take a quick blood sample. "Hey! What did you do that for?" the ever-perceptive child wanted to know. "I'm testing your blood for infections," he claimed, and quickly let the sample vanish. Anakin looked at him doubtfully, then to his father, who merely shrugged. The Jedi was relieved to see them dismiss it. In the evening, young Anakin took Padme with him to show her his personal racing pod, while Qui-Gon helped Mrs. Skywalker to wash the dishes. Shortly before going to bed, he sent the data of the blood sample to his Padawan on the ship to be analyzed. He did not know what he would do if the child was indeed force sensitive. On the one hand, he was on an important mission and could not afford being distracted. Also, the boy was older than any initiative. On the other hand, taking part in dangerous pod races and flying through the galaxy hunting down criminals was not something a 9-year-old should be doing. He could put his abilities to much better use as a Jedi. In the end, however, it was likely he wouldn't have to worry about it at all. If either the boy or his parents refused to send him to the temple, there was nothing Qui-Gon would be able to do about it. Okay, so first, I'm no Force expert, so I have no idea how much truth there is to Vader's explanations. It's just something that made sense to me, the thing about the Force being connected to emotions, I mean. Also, he had to describe it to Anakin in a way he would understand, but also didn't paint a dark side in a way that's too evil. That's where the hungry analogy came from. Second, I know that a hyperdrive is very big, and so I suppose it really wouldn't make sense to have a spare one. But on most pictures there are more than one shiny dot that pushes the ship into hyperspace, and you need supposedly all of them to make the jump. In that case, having 1 or 2 spare engines wouldn't take up too much space. It's still impractical since changing them would take too much time in a combat situation. Then again, we're talking about Anakin Skywalker here. He repaired his pod 2 to 3 times during a race without losing speed when he was 9 freaking years old. Having the Force to lift heavy thing could also help. So yeah, even though they make it look as if a spare hyperdrive is a must-have for everyone, it's really only possible because this is Darth Vader and Darth Vader Jr. we're talking about. Darth Vader sipped at his cup of bantha milk, blue eyes stained with yellow unfocused as he stretched his senses to locate each and every person currently under his roof. He didn't care that it was a drink usually reserved for sick children. It was a dang good drink. Besides, he was a freaking Sith Lord. He could crush the internal organs of 10 people at the same time just by looking at them. He was confident that drinking milk did nothing to destroy his impressive and at times terrifying aura. If someone thought differently, he was more than ready to demonstrate. The Sith had had a hard time keeping himself from relieving the old Jedi of his head. Even though he had lived somewhat peaceful for 3 years, there were another 20 years of habit to overcome. It wasn't even that he hated Qui-Gon Jinn. Actually, the man could very well be the only Jedi that he had never hated. Qui-Gon had freed him and offered him a future. But what was even more important for Vader was that he had been ready to teach him even against the wish of the Council. He didn't know how far the knight would have actually taken his promise. Still, he had always admired this man. According to Kenobi, this hadn't been the first time he defied the Council, far from it. It was the reason he hadn't been offered a spot in their midst even though he was powerful enough. Vader had often wondered what his life would have been like if Qui-Gon had taken up the role of his master. Unlike Kenobi, the rule-abiding perfect Jedi, Qui-Gon had character. He had a heart and he was not afraid to follow it. Vader might have been able to come to trust him, maybe even enough to tell him about Padme. Qui-Gon, as a Jedi Master, did have access to the Holy Jedi holocrons and might just have been willing to help and still keep his relationship a secret. Yes, much could have ended differently if Qui-Gon had survived. For this at least Vader wanted to spare him even though everything else in him balked at the idea at letting any Jedi live, much less one who he could have used so well to hurt Kenobi. Vader had been gone for most of the night, searching for some sand people to take his anger out on. Unfortunately, they were slowly growing extinct and he had to travel farther and farther to find some. He didn't like to admit it, but seeing Padme again after so many years had shaken him to the very core. She was young, only 14 years old, and so she wasn't exactly as he remembered her. But she was beautiful and he saw her compassion, her sense for justice, her strength glowing in her eyes, and he knew she was the same person. It had been hard, pretending he didn't know her, but he knew that he had to keep a hold of himself. A relationship between them was impossible now. Not because of the age difference and not even because his younger self had already taken a liking to her, but because he was no longer Anakin Skywalker. He was Darth Vader, a ruthless Sith who only felt alive when war was raging around him, and as much as it pained him to admit, he knew that Padme would not be able to love what he had become. That did not mean he couldn't do everything in his power, which was a lot, to make sure she lived this time around. It was not unusual for him to vanish a couple of hours without notice. It was unusual for him to sneak into his own house in the late morning. Darth Vader waited until he sensed that Padme went to help Shmi search for Jar Jar, who had probably gotten into some kind of trouble again. Oh, how Vader craved to put his lightsaber through that annoying creature, and Anakin was with Qui-Gon in the living room, asking him for stories about his Jedi adventures. Vader stepped into the room. He always took great care to conceal his power around the Jedi to avoid notice. This time, he managed to observe them for a full 7 minutes before anyone noticed him. "Good morning, Dad," Anakin finally called. "Master Jin said they want to leave for their ship soon. But there's still the issue with the hyperdrive." Vader nodded slowly. "I have thought about the problem and came to the conclusion that we can afford to help them out this time. You may sell them what they need for credits. I can exchange it for new goods on my next trip." "That's great. Thanks, Dad." Qui-Gon's shoulders visibly fell in relief and he smiled. "I thank you as well, Lord Vader. We are indebted to you." Honestly, Vader just wanted to get them off his planet. "There is another issue I would like to address," the Jedi began. He somehow managed not to flinch under Vader's burning gaze. "Speak." "You son, Anakin. He is what we Jedi call Force sensitive. He was born with the ability to wield the powers of the Force. The Jedi could help him to train this ability and reach his full potential." He turned to the child. "I would like to offer you to come with us to Coruscant." Vader closed his eyes to hide the sudden spike of pain in his heart as Anakin let out an excited sound. "Do you mean I could become a Jedi, like you?" "That's right. You have very good instincts, a keen perception, and sometimes you know things that are about to happen, which makes people think you have great reflexes as well. If you weren't born in the Outer Rim, we would have found you sooner, but I believe it is not too late to start your training yet." "Oh, I would like to come with you. I already had some Force training, so I'm sure I could do great." "Dad, please, can I go?" Vader stood rigidly, his arms crossed in front of his chest and fighting the urge to let his dark power flare, to take the Jedi and just rip him apart. He had known it would come to this, of course. He had even made sure it would by using the Force to let Anakin's grip on his knife slip yesterday. He had guessed right that Qui-Gon would jump at the opportunity to test his midi-chlorian level. Still, it pained him how readily Anakin agreed to dedicate his life to an order that would bring him so much pain. It reminded Vader of the day Sidious had declared himself Emperor and the whole Senate had applauded the downfall of the Republic. Not only that, but Anakin had also blurted out that he'd had training when Vader had spent so much time and effort to make sure he never revealed his abilities to strangers. Evidently, Qui-Gon did not count as a stranger to him anymore. Anakin probably didn't even realize that he'd brought his father in a very precarious situation with his words. As expected, Qui-Gon turned to Vader next with a light scowl. "You knew that he was Force sensitive, didn't you? He inherited his power from you. I know that you are no Jedi, but then how were you able to teach him? Why did you not bring him to the temple?" Just because the Jedi are the only institution that teaches the Force does not mean they offer a good education, Vader replied shortly without addressing the first question. Anakin seemed to have realized what he'd done because he bit his lip and looked down guilty. As a Sith, Vader could never have just brought Anakin to the Jedi himself, and the boy had never before expressed the desire to join them, so there hadn't been a reason to search for alternative ways either. "If you will excuse us, I would like to speak to my son alone." Qui-Gon nodded in understanding and left the room. Vader sighed deeply. He was almost sure that he was going to hate himself for what he was about to do. The Sith knelt in front of the couch Anakin was seated on and met his eyes seriously. "Anakin, I have told you before that I would leave the decision what to do with your life to you. If you want to join the Jedi, I will not stand in your way, but there are a few things that you have to know first." The child nodded mutely, eyes wide. "You would be a terrible Jedi, Anakin." "No, let me speak. You are powerful, more powerful than any of them. I don't doubt that you would become formidable in the art of lightsaber fighting, that the Force would heed your every call, and that your bravery would let you come out on top in every conflict. But that is not what being a Jedi is about. I know you want to be one of them because everyone respects them, because they earn so much glory and have many adventures. But Jedi are supposed to serve the people. They don't have material possessions and they don't crave for attention. They try everything to keep the peace and avoid fighting, while you want to rush right into it. I know that being a Jedi means nothing to you, and that the real reason you want to go with these people is because of that beautiful girl in our garden." Anakin blushed red at that, but Vader wasn't finished yet. "I know you want to impress Padme and be near her, and you believe that as a Jedi you might have more opportunities to meet her at court. You are more right about that than you know. But Jedi are not allowed any attachments, be it friendship or love. As a Jedi you won't be allowed to see your mother or me again in a long time. They will do everything in their power to break our bond because you are supposed to care for every person the same and have no favorites. You want to join them for all the wrong reasons, and that is why you will fail as a Jedi. I am sorry. I didn't know. I think you should go with them." "What?" Vader felt that old hurt in his heart again, but forced himself to smile. "You will be isolated and under constant scrutiny with them, but if you can ignore that, then you can do a lot of good in the galaxy in your own way. The Jedi will never really trust you, will never really rely on you, but everyone else, every person you save and help, they will love you for your power and your charm and celebrate you as a hero. Also, while it might be a horrible way to get close to this young woman, it might also be the only one. You would be a terrible Jedi because you cannot heed to their rules, but the rules of the Jedi are stupid, and as long as you don't get caught breaking them, you can still be great. You just have to remember that if it gets too much for you, you can always leave the order and come back to me. I will always be there for you." "Thank you, Dad. I will remember it. I will remember you, always. I promise that I won't forget you. I want to come back and visit you and Mom." "That might get difficult," Vader said. "Why?" "Anakin, the only reason I stayed on this annoying planet for so long was to make sure you got a proper education. Now that Shmi has her new job and you want to go to the Jedi, I have to decide anew what I want to do." The Sith have been calling me for years and now the Jedi are aware of my presence as well. Great conflict, maybe even war lies ahead and I have no longer an excuse to keep away from it. I cannot tell you much about it, else I run the risk of facing the Jedi and you as an enemy and that would get awkward really fast. Anakin chuckled at his words. Vader was amazed that he had managed to distract the boy from the fundamental message by joking. It proved that he was still very much a boy. It didn't matter though. He didn't want Anakin to understand his words in their full meaning, not now. In a decade or a half he would look back on this day and realize that he had been warned from the terrible catastrophe he had been heading into. The Jedi would tell him all kinds of horror stories about the Sith, try their best to turn him against him, to convince him Vader had only sent him to them as a spy. But Anakin would not be able to blame Vader for betraying him, for withholding information. If anything it would be the other way around because it was Anakin who chose to go and it would be him who was obligated to leave his order if he wanted to avoid clashing with Vader because he only chose to join the Jedi for petty reasons or those that were completely unrelated to his mission. Vader on the other hand could convincingly pretend he actually believed in what he fought for. In reality he was just growing so tired of playing happy family. He missed the war something fierce and he had every intention to make sure the Clone Wars took place. If he was lucky he might even be able to start them a couple of years earlier. Confident in the suggestions he had planted into his younger self, Darth Vader stood. Have you decided then? Do you still want to go with the Jedi? I do. Maybe you're right and it's not the way for me but it's the only thing I could imagine doing when I'm older. Vader nodded. He had expected nothing else. They will probably ask you a number of questions about your training and me. You may answer as truthfully as you see fit. They will probably search your mind and get the answers they want forcefully if you don't. Will it really be all right? You said the Jedi attack people like you without question. And I told you multiple times that the Jedi cannot threaten me. It really is completely pointless to worry about me. But you will be bored out of your mind without me, Anakin teased. Oh, I will busy myself. Maybe I will start a war or two to keep myself occupied. You could have your fun in it as well, you know, to kill some time, and people. Dad. You're terrible. Darth Vader laughed deeply, the uncommon sound vibrating deep in his chest. Don't say I didn't warn you, he said and ruffled his son's hair, who huffed indignantly. He really was curious how this would play out. XXX. Master, with all due respect, but are you sure this is a good idea? Padawan Obi-Wan Kenobi watched the father and son suspiciously as they took apart the rear of their spaceship, doing Force knows what with it. Lord Vader and his son are doing us a great favor installing the spare parts themselves. Their family has one of the best equipped droid shops I have ever seen, and from what I've heard, they build most of them themselves. They make their money by buying broken parts, repairing and selling them again. I am confident in their ability. That is not what I meant, Obi-Wan clarified. I'm talking about your decision to take the boy to the temple. Isn't he a bit too old for it? I have a feeling he is very talented. He will catch up quickly. Obi-Wan had seen his midi-chlorian levels. Talented was not the words he would use in this case. More like ridiculously overpowered. But the ability to use the Force was only a small part of what identified a Jedi. The boy had never gone to any sort of school. It was likely he didn't even know how to learn properly. He would be years behind in subjects such as galactic history, protocol, and manners and politics. Having a bounty hunter as a father, he probably wasn't that into diplomacy either. It's not his abilities that worry me, Obi-Wan said. He simply has not been raised in the Jedi way and it will be difficult for him to adjust. He is old enough that he'd remember his parents. Just look at the both of them, he will have a hard time getting rid of this attachment. There is a reason why the temple takes in children when they are, well, younger. You mean moldable, Qui-Gon replied wryly. I do not think it is a bad thing for a Jedi to have a bit of character on his own. If we all have exactly the same mindset, it will make the Order inflexible and vulnerable. Also, if such power is left unsupervised, he could easily succumb to darkness, not knowing of the dangers. I have never seen test results like his. It is as if he's filled with midi-chlorians from head to toe. He hesitated for a moment. Master? There is something else, isn't there? Indeed, my Padawan. There is an old Jedi legend, a prophecy that speaks of a chosen one, a person that will bring balance to the Force in a time of great need. The Force shall be stronger in him than in anyone else. You believe that he is this person? I think he could be. But the world isn't in any sort of great need. Not yet, Obi-Wan. Not yet. XXX. Darth Vader threw one last glance at the ship that was going to take his younger self away. Replacing the damaged parts hadn't been too much work, but they had taken their time adding a couple of updates. Vader had left the majority of the work to Anakin while he went and ambushed a terrified beeping R2, took him completely apart and practically rebuilt him from scratch with all the nifty little additions his other self would have added in the coming years. Including a well-hidden virus that prevented a complete memory wipe while still keeping the data safe and left an open channel for him to turn the astromech into a communicator that he could use to contact his son in case of emergency. All the while he was alert and maintained a deep connection with the Force in an attempt to sense a certain dark presence that was sure to confront them soon. Last time, the majority of this day had been spent at the Bunta Eve. He had no reason to believe that Sidious Assassin would change his schedule, and as such he was only going to attack in the evening. Vader very much wanted to get rid of him before he could kill Qui-Gon, and thus he had to stall the ship's departure until then. But he had run out of updates, and if he kept the group here any longer they might start to get suspicious. Finally Vader felt a tiny tremor in the dark side of the Force, alerting him of the arrival of Darth Maul. He was still far away though, somewhere on the other side of Mos Espa. Vader rolled his eyes. That was just wonderful. He had never had much respect for Sidious' first apprentice, but this was a new low. Carefully Vader reached out through the dark side, letting his power nudge the other aura almost gently, as if greeting a friend. It was a difficult task. Not only did he have no connection to this man to guide him, but he also had to cloak his actions from the Jedi. The other presence recoiled from his touch, slamming up mental shields. Vader, however, made no attempt to break into his mind. He didn't need to. He was perfectly capable of imagining Maul looking around frantically, searching for a foe that wasn't there. His ridiculously long range of the Force was one of Vader's more distinctive traits. He could kill a person on the other side of the galaxy by force choking them as long as he could see said person via video or holo image. If he had no clear view on his victim, it had to be close enough for him to sense his presence. Of course, even he couldn't kill a Sith, even a half-trained one, with nothing but a force choke. He couldn't even invade his mind without seeing him, but he could project his presence as a tremor in the Force, offering an open channel. Finally Maul seemed to have realized he was not going to get attacked, yet, and carefully lifted his shields just enough to allow the most basic of communications. Vader jumped at the chance and immediately sent him a mental image of the Queen's starship that was making the last preparations for the start. A faint sense of curiosity was sent through the connection, but Vader broke it without answering the silent question. He didn't care if Maul thought he was friend or foe as long as he just came here so he could kill him. The ship was about to leave. He just needed 5 more minutes. Anakin, he called, and the boy who had been chatting with Qui-Gon next to the ramp, turned to him. Vader opened his arms slightly. You don't plan on leaving without saying goodbye, do you? Anakin grinned and sprinted towards him, throwing himself into his arms. Vader held him tightly, whispering into his ear. Remember what I told you. Don't let the Jedi get to you. They always talk about how you shouldn't be afraid, but the truth is, they are all terribly scared of the dark side. They see shadows where there are none, and in doing so create discontentment. Their suspicion leads to frustration and anger, and in the end, they create what they fear most themselves. Even now, the Jedi are continuously working towards their own downfall. Take care not to fall alongside them. I won't, Anakin promised, squeezing him some more. "I'll miss you, Dad. I will always be there with you, son. Just look into a mirror. If you ever need my help, feel free to reach out to me through the Force. Our connection is strong. I'll remember it." Vader ruffled his hair one last time. "Anakin, please enter the ship now." "Lord Vader, I think it is best if you left now." Vader turned to see that Qui-Gon had tensed up, his gaze directed at the distance. So he had felt it too then. Anakin wanted to follow his order, but Vader kept a firm hand on his shoulder. "What is going on?" he asked, playing the obvious, if slightly offended father. "Can't I say a proper goodbye to my son? Please forgive me, but there is someone coming, someone dangerous. It is prudent that we start now." Anakin looked up at him questioningly. "Dad." Maul was approaching fast. "Just a little longer." "Master," Kenobi called out from within the ship. He too had caught on. "Very well then. Take care, Anakin." His younger self hurried towards the ship while Qui-Gon drew his lightsaber. "Lord Vader, you have to go, now." "I won't be going anywhere if my son could be in danger," he retorted, not moving a single inch. "Start the ship already." But it was too late. From behind the dunes, a figure was fast approaching. Darth Maul was an imposing young man, his robes pitch black and his red skin almost glowing, dark tattoos making him look even more menacing. Vader barely kept himself from sneering at him. Compared to him, the Sith apprentice was a cute little puppy. He may not have his armor right now, but that barely made any difference. Vader's cybernetic limbs had been stronger and more durable than his organic ones, of course, but there was a limit to their strength, while now he was able to up his abilities with the Force. He was going to crush the boy like an ant under his boot. Maul drew his lightsaber, prepared to attack the ship to get to the Queen within. Kenobi called out for his master. Qui-Gon shouted at him to get the ship starting while he was holding off the foe. For a couple of seconds, Vader let the two battle each other, using his observation to remember Maul's fighting style. He was attacking fiercely, determined to get rid of the Jedi Master fast so he could go after his real victim. Behind them the engines began to roar. Qui-Gon took care to keep Maul away from both the ship and from Vader. He seemed to be determined to stay behind to protect his charges. Maul sensed this and with a leap he somersaulted over Qui-Gon, ready to attack Vader, probably hoping the Jedi would bear a weakness. "You've got to be kidding me," Vader muttered. With a snap his own red lightsaber sprung alive. Qui-Gon's shout as he realized Maul's new target was cut short as he stared wide-eyed at the two Sith crossing blades. Maul too was startled for a moment until Vader aimed a powerful kick right to his chest that threw him away, so he landed on his back with a pained moan. For a moment time seemed to stand still as both Force users stared at him shocked. "What are you waiting for, Jedi?" Vader snarled, not bothering to hide the contempt in his voice. "Get onto that ship. I will take care of this nuisance." Maul had caught himself and sprang to his feet. Vader held his saber with both hands and began to call on the dark side. His first strike almost knocked the weapon out of his opponent's hands. The apprentice called onto the Force as well, and soon their auras were clashing against each other just as their sabers were. Light was flashing as the lasers touched, faster and faster as their duel progressed. Maul was good at dueling, he really was, but Vader's Force presence was overwhelming. The air grew too thick to breathe, pressing down on his enemy, chilling his blood, shaking his hands. Vader felt the fear leak through his shields and his blood began to boil with the rush of battle. It had been such a long time since he had last faced a real challenge, and he was determined to enjoy it. And so he pushed a little further, invisible hands clinging to the other Sith, halting his movements, pressing against his windpipe. Vader delivered a symbolic cut on his shoulder to show his superiority, only to back away again, decreasing the pressure, letting him come at him again. He was playing with his prey. "Who are you?" Maul gasped as he realized the unfortunate position he was in. "I am Darth Vader," the Sith Lord growled, and Force felt it good to say that name, his real name after so many years. He felt like he was only now truly alive. With a flurry of strikes and stabs he closed in on the apprentice. He wanted to kill, to murder, to feel the blood on his hands, not because it was a job or because it was somehow necessarily, but simply for the joy of slaying a foe that was not completely helpless. The dark side flew powerfully through him, not with anger but with madness, and it felt so good. For a moment he almost felt bad for Anakin that he wouldn't experience this for at least a decade. Qui-Gon had finally stopped staring at them and hurried into the ship. Maul was momentarily distracted as it began to move, setting course for the horizon. Vader used his weakness to attack viciously. The smell of burned flesh filled the air, followed by a pained shout, and then Maul's right hand with the saber still in it flew through the air, ending up buried in the sand behind him. Darth Maul sank to his knees, forced to watch with hatred but also helplessly as Vader approached slowly, his long red saber brushing the sand as he walked up to him almost casually. The apprentice closed his eyes in pain. He knew that this was his end. XXX. Wow, I don't know what I did right, but I got almost twice as many reviews on the last chap than usual. You guys are awesome. To clear up a few things, I mentioned it again during this chapter, Vader doesn't dislike Qui-Gon, he's just wary of the Jedi in general. He respects him, but he spent a couple of days with him some decades ago, so their bond isn't that strong. He would like to have him teach Anakin instead of Obi-Wan, which is why he's making an effort to be friendly, but he's a Sith and those are used to cutting Jedi's throats, not make conversation with them. Which is why the dinner was so awkward. You asked why he was so mean to Qui-Gon. He really wasn't. For Darth Vader's standards, that was a loving welcome. About his plans, why he wants Anakin to become a Jedi again, I keep his plans purposefully vague, partly so as to not ruin the surprise for you, but partly also because Vader hasn't decided it himself yet. He's still somewhat wary that people he used to share a connection with like Sidious and Kenobi might find out about his plans through Force visions if he sets them in stone. That's not actually true, since part of him being free from Force means nobody gets visions about him, no past, no future. But he doesn't know that yet. Also, remember that Vader was never one for making long-term plans. Battle plans, yes, but everything that's a year or farther in the distance, he likes to just go with the flow. He learned some things from Sidious, and so he's placing chess pieces in good positions, but he doesn't have a detailed plan on how to use them. Finally, it is hinted time and time again but never actually said, I believe I should tell you now, Vader's main goal is for Luke and Leia to be born. He has to follow the original timeline as close as possible until the twins are born. He's not feeling too bad about it here because he knows Anakin will be happy, but he also dislikes sending him with the Jedi because he knows it will eventually be the root of all his pain. Of course nothing ever goes according to plan and Vader does become something of a megalomaniac during too much power, but he's still trying to lay low and not change any big things until the twins come. Then he wants Padme to live, Anakin to live, Sidious to die, Padme to be happy, Anakin to be happy, and he, Vader himself, to live. He also wants to have a nice Imperial fleet for himself. In exactly that order of importance. The problem is that his lower priorities are far easier to reach. He has a decade to work on those while he can do absolutely nothing about the first. You may wonder why Padme's happiness is so far behind in that list. It's because he knows she would hate what he's done, what he's become, and that as a senator of the Republic and a pacifist, she's technically his enemy who will interfere with his plans to kill Sidious. He wouldn't mind sacrificing his own life so his past self and she could have a happy family, but he's an arrogant jerk who thinks he always knows best for everyone and that without him they won't ever be happy together. Set the coordinates for the jump to hyperspace, now, Qui-Gon called as soon as the ramp closed behind him. Obi-Wan glared at the small boy that was currently helping Jar Jar with his safety belt. You failed to mention that your daddy is a Force user and has a lightsaber. The handmaiden, Padme, who failed to notice the significance of a red lightsaber, laid a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. I'm sure your father will be fine, Anakin. Surely that man is already tired from his fight with Master Jin, isn't he? Anakin merely smiled at her. I don't worry about him, he said. My father is strong. The two Jedi exchanged a look but said nothing as the jump required their full attention. Still Obi-Wan was stiff the entire time. Even as the ship left behind the planet at a rapid speed, he still felt the slow uncurling of a massive amount of power behind them. It was a dark and inherently evil power that made him feel as if they were only barely escaping through the sharp fangs of a monster closing its maw behind them. He felt his hands began to sweat and fear rise in his chest, despite his best efforts to release his feelings into the Force. It was only when they were in hyperspace, a safe distance away from the two Sith, that Qui-Gon took the boy aside to question him. Anakin, you said you already have some training in the Force, didn't you? The Master asked, and Obi-Wan blanched. That's right. I only ever did small things though. What exactly did you do? Well, I can move small things without touching them, like wires or tools that I need to repair things. I can make myself unnoticeable and use the Force to make myself stronger and faster and to sense things coming at me. My dad had me mediate a lot and do warm UPS that turned out to be saber forms, but I haven't actually gotten a saber yet. Obi-Wan shuddered for a moment. While none of these exercises sounded especially dark to him, there were some things that were unusual. Influencing the mind of weak people was one thing, and it was hard enough, but to make oneself unnoticeable one had to layer his surroundings with the Force, basically sending a widespread command to ignore you. It was an ability that was a requirement for a knight. Even most Padawans struggled with it, no initiate could hope to do this. Also, using the Force for mundane tasks such as letting some tools float to you was against the Jedi Code. Anakin, did your father ever talk to you about the dark side of the Force? Qui-Gon asked gently. Anakin scowled and crossed his arms in front of him. Yes, he did. I know that my dad is a Sith, but he isn't part of the Sith Order. He doesn't have anything against the Jedi. He thinks that I'll be terrible at it and come running back to him, but I won't. I really want to become a Jedi. Qui-Gon sighed and looked at the boy helplessly. You can't be a Sith without being in the Sith Order, Obi-Wan meant, barely containing his anger. The Order contains only one person and sometimes, an apprentice. Sith are masters of manipulation, Anakin, and I very much doubt that him allowing you to come with us, or maybe even you wanting to go, is a coincidence. This complicates things greatly. You should have told us about it before. The Council might not accept somebody from your origins even if your intentions are pure. This only made the boy angry. My father may use the dark side occasionally, but he's not evil. He's a good person and a great dad. He saved us from this other guy, didn't he? He's always been there for me and never broke any laws. I don't see what's so bad about it. You don't see what's so bad about it, Obi-Wan called out incredulously. Listen to yourself. Do you have any idea what the dark side is? What it does to people? I never used it myself, if that's what you mean. But I saw my father using it, 2 times when he was fighting against a criminal we were hunting, and once. He swallowed. One time when I was kidnapped and sold to the Hutts. He was really angry then. I know how it changes him, and I hate to see him like that. It's scary. But what he did it to save me, and he always came back to me. Dad told me not to use the dark side without guidance, but I don't want to use it at all. I knew if I told you, you wouldn't take me with you. Maybe you would have even attacked my dad. I couldn't risk that. Qui-Gon still looked unsure. Obi-Wan took him aside and whispered, Master, we can't take him with us. The Council will never allow it. And even if it did, this shadow will always hang over him. The other children will ostracize him, calling him Sith spawn. He will never truly be able to connect with them. He will never fit in. Do you propose we bring him back then? Or maybe drop him off on a random planet without supervision? His father will come to get him back and raise him as a Sith. What if he really is the chosen one? We cannot let him fall into the hands of darkness. If Vader's power level is anywhere near Anakin's, he is a terrible foe. As long as Anakin learns at the temple, he might at least restrain himself as he did in the past years, which gives the Council more time to decide what to do about him. And don't forget about the attacker. He wore a red lightsaber too, and I could feel the Force was strong in him. Then he was Vader's apprentice, coming to kill him and take the title of Master for himself. No, this man was not after Vader. He ignored him completely until he thought he could get to me by attacking him. I think he was after Queen Amidala. Vader was protecting the ship. It doesn't make sense that he would send his student to kill her. Then the attacker must have been the Master. He wouldn't allow his apprentice to train his son as a Sith, which is why he gave him to us. I only saw little from their fight, but I could tell that Vader had the advantage very quickly. That doesn't make any sense. It does if there are more than 2 Sith around. Obi-Wan was shocked. First, there are no Sith for centuries, and now there shall be 3 or even more. That is impossible. The Jedi would have noticed it. This man has been pretending to be a respectable bounty hunter working for the Republic for years. The dark side is not always easy to recognize. We have just discovered the beginnings of a far greater plot. We must not make rash decisions. The young Anakin could be the key to everything. He could also be a spy. What other reason would a Sith have to hide in the Outer Rim, playing happy family? The boy is clearly loyal to him. He is loyal to his father, not the monster that is undoubtedly hiding behind the mask. In time he will reveal himself, and we can use this time to prepare him. For Qui-Gon, that was the end of the discussion, and for the rest of the flight, he refused to talk about it. Obi-Wan though was still fuming over it silently for quite some time before he was able to release his anxiety into the Force. He had to trust his master in this matter. He knew he should, but at the same time he couldn't help but remember all the occasions in which his master's compassion had caused them trouble. He had the distinctive feeling that this Anakin Skywalker was the very epitome of trouble. XXX. Jedi Master Yoda slowly opened his eyes, his connection to the Force lessening as he ended his mediation. He had communicated with the Force time and time again in the past hours, ever since they had received Qui-Gon Jinn's report. They were glad that the group had managed to save Queen Amidala, but they had brought another problem with them. Most of the council members had immediately rejected the idea of taking in the son of a Sith, one that had already begun to be trained and shaped by him. Yoda had thought much about the matter, but the future of this boy remained completely open. The Force told him he was more than capable in terms of intelligence and power. He would have no problem completing training as a Padawan, but everything after that was blurry at best. The old master had tried to look into the fate of his father as well, but here he was shown absolutely nothing, no future, and even more astonishing, no past either. The appearance of a new Sith was troubling enough, and that was not even taking in the assassin. Also there was the possibility of young Skywalker being the chosen one. They could not allow the young one to go unsupervised, but at the same time taking him in and treating him like a prisoner would only drive him to the dark side. No, he would have to look at the boy himself in order to decide. The council session began, and Qui-Gon, his Padawan, and the small boy entered. The Jedi started to question him, and much that they had already known from Master Jinn's report was confirmed. "What do you think, Master Yoda?" Mace Windu asked once the boy had told his tale. Little fear in him, I feel. Surprising, it is. He did not know how, but Yoda had the feeling that this was not how it was supposed to be. Not concerned about your parents, you are. Most children his age clung to their parents. It was why the Jedi separated them so soon, when their attachment could still be easily broken. Jinn, however, had described the relationship between the boy and his parents as very good. Surely the Sith would have made sure to form a strong bond with his powerful offspring? "I don't have to be afraid for them," Anakin said, a little confused. "My father is strong. Nothing can happen to him, and he protects my mother, so she's safe too. Great confidence you have in his abilities. Understand you must that a powerful Sith is not a good thing. My dad has given up everything for my family. He uses his power to protect us. Why does everyone think that's a bad thing? We are not convinced of his sincerity, Windu explained. Even if we allow you to become a Jedi, he will always be your weakness. Sith are often temperamental and impulsive. He could simply change his mind and decide he is not satisfied with his current, modest lifestyle. If you are not willing to fight against him when we ask it of you, you are endangering not only yourself but the whole order. Also, too old he is, Yoda mused. Allow him into the temple, we cannot. I would offer to teach him myself, Qui-Gon spoke up when he saw Anakin's dejected look. Master, Obi-Wan called out in surprise. One Padawan, you already have. Impossible it is, to take two. Obi-Wan is ready to take the exam. He will be a good knight, Qui-Gon said. Decide this, the council will. But his age not the only problem is, If I may make a suggestions, Qui-Gon said. Anakin Vader seemed to have been very careful not to break any laws, so we cannot do anything against him officially anyway. He seems to be a very influential person on Tatooine. Nothing is known about his past before he came to the planet to free his family. It can however be assumed that he was an apprentice to a Sith master. I believe this master still exists and that he is not on the best terms with him, which would explain why he fought the Dark Assassin, who I assume replaced him as the apprentice. We could contact Lord Vader and ask for information about the other Sith. If he is willing to help, it would lower the chances that this is all part of an elaborate scheme, wouldn't it? The council discussed this idea for a couple of minutes. Finally, they agreed. The holo receiver in the middle of the room was activated and a message sent to Tatooine. It was only a couple of seconds before the connection was accepted. The transparent blue figure of Anakin Vader appeared in the middle of the room. I assume you are a Jedi on Coruscant, the Sith spoke calmly, facing Yoda. What is the reason you called me and why are you using my son's ID? Grandmaster Yoda, I am here with the council. Your son is. Many questions he has raised. You still haven't decided what to do with him, have you? He snorted. Let me see my son. Yoda motioned for the boy to step forward. Hi Dad, the boy called out, completely unaffected by the dark glare the Sith wore. Said glare immediately disappeared as the man looked down on his son, a grin spreading on his face. Hey there, Anakin. How was your journey? Oh, it was boring. I thought for sure we'd get attacked at least once, but we traveled through hyperspace most of the time, so nothing really happened. But guess what? When we got here I talked to some of the pilots and they said that none of their ships carried a spare hyperdrive. Can you believe that? Incredibly foolish of them, Vader agreed with a nod. What happened to the red guy that attacked you? Are you all right? I dealt with him as I saw fit, Vader replied shortly. It is highly unlikely you will ever see him again. Okay. The Jedi Masters want to ask you something. Tell Mom I love her. I will. Anakin made room for the council again and Vader's expression turned cold again at once. It really was a disconcerting sight, as if a switch had been flipped. What do you want from me? Many troubling things about his upbringing, young Skywalker has told us, Yoda began. True it is, that trained you were in the dark side of the Force and use it regularly. It is. A tremor went through the assembled Jedi at this last confirmation. Ask I may, who taught you? You may, but I doubt you will find me answering. What do you know about the man who attacked the ship? Windu asked. You are talking about Darth Maul. I'm afraid my knowledge about him is very limited. Do you know who sent him or who he was after? It appeared to me he was after someone in the ship. I didn't ask for his allegiances. Windu scowled deeply. Your son is insisting that you are not an enemy of ours, yet you are not very forthcoming with information. We need a proof that you aren't a danger to the peace of the Republic. Vader muttered something that sounded suspiciously like, which peace? Loud he said, I do not see a need to prove anything to the Jedi. You have no authority over me at all and I couldn't care less what you think about me. Jedi Master Ki-Adi Mondi rose to speak, I believe you should care, if only because the fate of your son depends on it. You have already admitted to using the dark side, a most terrible crime. You will have to make some kind of deal. If at all possible." Vader's scowl became even colder. "Please correct me if I'm wrong, Master Jedi. Are you indeed demanding I betray my former comrades so I may paint a target on the back of my family? Are you, that you gloat about being keepers of the peace, threatening me, unofficial ruler over Tatooine, a planet known for its neutrality yet has a definition of law that most certainly never addresses the use of the dark side? Do you honestly believe it is wise to openly antagonize me, a known Sith Lord, by holding my son hostage?" He didn't even sound angry anymore, merely amused. "Let me tell you the following: you will take in Anakin. You will teach him in the way of the Force. You will not oppress him and you will not judge him based solely on his origins. You will welcome him with open arms as you do with all the younglings, and you will do everything in your power to make sure he grows up to be a healthy, strong young man who is content if not happy to work with you. If you do this, then maybe, just maybe I will consider forgetting about the terrible insult you have delivered to me. I might consider not joining forces with the Sith Lord that sent Darth Maul and ensure he succeeds in wiping out the entire Jedi Order on his way to world domination. That is the only deal I'm going to offer you, and you will be well advised to take it now." Suffice to say, in the aftermath of Darth Vader's speech, the Council refused to take in Anakin Skywalker. XXX. Qui-Gon left the Council chamber with long strides, trying but failing to squelch the anger in his chest. A Sith Lord, indeed. The dark side knows only extremes, his Padawan Obi-Wan muttered next to him, equally agitated but for different reasons. He turned to the young boy following them who had been unusually silent. "What is he thinking, mocking the Council like that, threatening to wipe us out? Was he serious?" Anakin grimaced a bit. "Sometimes it's hard to tell with him. He did essentially wipe out Tatooine's native people because they threatened me." Obi-Wan stopped. "You failed to mention that when you talked about how he was such a law-abiding citizen. The Hutts hold the law on Tatooine and they declared the Sand People outlaw. They're bandits who threaten their business more often than they're of use, so what he did wasn't illegal, strictly speaking. Still, I'm not surprised the Jedi refused you when you hide things like that." Anakin opened his mouth to retort, but Qui-Gon cut in. "Enough. Neither of you understands what really went on in that room." "What do you mean?" Anakin asked, a scowl that greatly resembled his father's for a moment edged onto his face. Vader wasn't mocking the Jedi. He wasn't even really threatening. He was testing us, and we failed the test. "I don't understand, Master," Obi-Wan admitted. "Unlike you, my young Padawan, I had the debatable pleasure of actually holding a conversation with this man. He doesn't think highly of the Jedi, but he doesn't hate us either. I believe his presence on Tatooine is an honest attempt to keep his neutrality," Qui-Gon explained. "I don't think the Council or even the Senate were aware that he is the reason behind the uproar on Tatooine, but sooner or later it would have become obvious who held the power. Tatooine might be a plain planet, but it does hold a strategically important position. The fact that its ruler is a Sith Lord would have come out eventually, especially since he apparently doesn't have a habit of hiding his abilities. As such, giving you, Anakin, to us was probably meant as insurance, an offer for mutual neutrality. Refusing to take you in even though you are very much Force sensitive is not only a sign of disrespect, it also shows that the Jedi mistrust him to a point where they won't even give him a chance. If the Jedi had agreed to ignore him, he might have succeeded in warding off this other Sith, who I presume to be his former master. He must have been hiding from him for years. Now that he has all but revealed himself, chances are high that he will indeed be forced to join with him again to avoid fighting both orders at the same time. Especially if he has killed this Darth Maul and the Master is in need of a new apprentice. But if his effort was earnest, if he really tried to come back from the dark, wouldn't he have been at least more polite?" Obi-Wan asked. "My father doesn't see the dark side as something bad," Anakin spoke up. "He would never run away from it. Anakin Vader, if that is really his name, has deliberately painted the worst image possible from his person. I presume he specifically told you to be honest with us." Anakin nodded to the Jedi's question. "As I suspected. He wanted us to take you in only when we were able to look past your origins. He made an offer of peace as honest as is possible for such a man, and we refused it, deeming the danger of there being a hidden motive too high." "But Master, don't you think they're right? About the hidden motive, I mean. That is not the point, Obi-Wan. Whenever there is a hidden motive or not, whatever his father has planned isn't Anakin's fault. Then the Council has valued the safety of the Jedi and the galaxy over the dream of a young boy. Isn't that exactly what we're supposed to do? There is no way of knowing if there is any risk at all. Even if there is, they should have shown at least a little faith in the Force. I offered to teach him, I wouldn't have let anything happen to him." "They're afraid of the dark," Anakin suddenly said. The statement startled the two Jedi and they suddenly stopped, looking at him. Anakin looked up from the ground, realization flashing in his eyes. "That's what my father said. The Jedi are so afraid of the dark side that they see dangers where there are none, and that in judging wrongly they create the very thing they're so scared of. At that time I thought he meant me. But maybe he was only speaking about himself." Qui-Gon hesitated. "I hate to admit it, but I think there might be some truth to your father's words, Anakin." "Master, you can't be serious." The Jedi turned back to his Padawan. "The Council is wise and always strives to do what's best for the galaxy. But they're not perfect. Nobody is, not even Master Windu or Master Yoda." Obi-Wan didn't know what to answer to that. "What will happen to me now?" Anakin asked. "Will I have to go back to Tatooine?" Qui-Gon looked down at him with a slight smile. "Don't give up hope yet, Anakin. I will think of a way to change the Council's mind. You will become a Jedi, I promise you that."